You've returned, once again, to the realm of nightmares. Tonight's story is darker than ever before. Are you ready to descend deeper into the abyss of terror with us? This happened about 2 years ago. I was out for a long walk in the woods, an activity I frequently do, especially in the summertime. On this day, I'd set out early. The route I typically take is in a large woodland with many different paths that take you deeper and deeper in. This time specifically, I decided to make a bit of a change to my usual routine. I decided to walk down a bank in order to walk alongside a river. You could catch glimpses of it if you were higher up on the path, but for the most part, you could really only hear it. It was also much more remote when compared to the other paths. I had been out for 3 hours at this point. I had a book, food and drink, and a first aid kit in my bag. I'd walked far and kept walking, exploring the area. However, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, but it was intense. I'm usually one for the quiet outdoors in nature, but this feeling I had kept making me look behind me to the point where I was no longer relaxed. As I got deeper into the woods, the loneliness became unnerving. I figured I was just scaring myself and tried not to play into it. That's when a cloaked figure with gloves on ran out in front of me. I instantly jumped and felt extremely alarmed. The figure had a mask on, a crow's mask, like, think a plague doctor mask. I wanted to run, and everything inside me was telling me to run, but for whatever reason, I really wanted to seem like I wasn't bothered and that the figure had failed to cause much of a reaction. So I awkwardly said, "Okay, good one. I'll be on my way now." The figure didn't say anything, rather, it began tilting its head as I walked around it and continued down the path. It was just standing there, watching me. I was extremely creeped out. Once I walked past it, I just kept walking, feeling shaken but trying not to let it show. I was nervous to look back, but eventually, I did. The creepy figure was still in the same place, still watching me walk away. He, or possibly she, gave me a wave, but not a friendly one, just a sinister one. I don't really know how to explain it, but it was slow and felt threatening. I was stupid. At this point, I felt far enough away from the figure, so I flipped at the bird, a choice I instantly regretted. The figure went from standing and waving to a full-on unhinged run in my direction. I, at this point, didn't stick around and legged it out of there. The figure was making intense, loud, and almost demonic noises as it chased me. I honestly thought I was going to die, but it all came to an end when I managed to outrun this freak and made it up onto an open footpath where I was reunited with joggers and dog walkers. I was stuck in this nervous state but still so beyond happy to see other people. I tried to make as many of them aware as I could, and the whole situation was ultimately reported. I got home safely by catching a bus into town. They were rare on that side of the county, but I managed, thankfully. I felt lucky yet really detached and uncomfortable. The area was investigated by police, but it was so deep in the woods, I don't know how much they covered. As of yet, nothing has been reported since, and nobody nor anything has been found. I now avoid that area and don't plan on going too far off the beaten track on my own again. I still think about this experience. It's still vivid in my mind and absolutely terrifying to me. Kara, Zelda, Mia, Cheryl, and myself. We all piled into Cheryl's truck. I was the one to find this place on Airbnb, and what was most appealing about it was the big deck with the hot tub on it that overlooked the lake. There was also a fire pit right by the water with a bunch of Adirondack chairs around it. Everything about it seemed perfect for a few days and nights of getting wasted with some friends. The Airbnb host told me that when we got to the property, there was a hidden key behind the mailbox to unlock the front driveway gate. The driveway was made of gravel and dirt, and it cut through a small opening in the woods, bringing a slight uphill to a bigger opening where the house was. Cheryl parked the truck right next to the front deck. The deck wrapped around the entire house, which was pretty cool. The first thing I did was walk to the back part of the deck and look at the view of the lake. It was very beautiful and peaceful. Too bad we were about to be blasting music and partying. Right as we were done unpacking, everyone cracked open beers, and we wasted no time letting the weekend begin. We played beer pong, cornhole, barbecued, and blasted music for hours. We were really loud because, as far as we knew, this was the only house around here. It's not like there were any nearby neighbors to complain. The phone connection out there was very spotty, so we really were just living in the moment, socializing with each other, not distracted by social media and whatnot. As it was getting darker and we were sitting by the fire pit, we all got startled when a voice came from the edge of the woods. It was some middle-aged woman with short hair. She started yelling at us to lower the music, so someone lowered the volume of the music. The woman started more or less lecturing us, saying how we out-of-towners always come here, litter in the lake, and create nothing but noise. She seemed like genuine white trash. I apologized on behalf of all of us, and one of the girls asked the woman if she lived nearby and if she could hear the music. The woman responded, still in a yell, that she couldn't even hear herself think. She didn't acknowledge the other question regarding if she lived nearby. Then, she just walked away into the woods, like literally into the dark woods. It was so strange. When we were sure she was out of earshot, we all erupted into laughter. As bizarre as the encounter was, we had to make light of it, but it also did put a slight damper on things considering we thought for sure we were far enough away from any neighboring houses to blast music and be loud. But we continued to drink, and pretty soon that concern was forgotten about, and we got loud again. Some immeasurable amount of time passed before a song ended, and it went quiet for a second, and we heard a voice calling out from the lake. We paused the music and listened, and sure enough, a voice was calling out for help in the middle of the lake. We all looked at each other nervously. I stood up and went to the water and yelled out, "Who's out there? Are you in the water?" The voice called back, "Yes, help." Adrenaline started to kick in. There was a kayak leaned up against the deck by the water with 2 sets of paddles. Cheryl and I agreed to paddle out there in an effort to save whoever was out there. We yelled out at them to keep calling out, but as we got in the water, the calls seemed to get further away no matter how deep we got into the lake. After like 5 to 10 minutes of rowing out to the complete darkness of this lake, calling out repeatedly for that man, we heard it was just utter silence. All we could see were the lights from the house sitting at the edge of the lake, and then just darkness in every other direction. It was only the sound of the light splashes of water and then screams, female screams, coming from the direction of the house. They sounded gut-wrenching, like genuine screams of danger. It sounded like more than one, at least 2 of the girls' screams. We immediately started paddling back, even more panicked now. The screams stopped long before we got back to the shore. We screamed out for our friends, but we checked inside and outside of the cabin, and all 4 of them were gone, vanished without a trace. We tried texting and calling them, but we had no bars, of course. Cheryl's truck was still there, so we took it and drove up the road looking for the nearest neighboring house. We found it, a similar opening in the woods that led up a hill and onto a property where we saw a house with the lights on. We went to ring the doorbell multiple times, but no one ever answered. We went to look through one of the windows in the front, and what we saw sent chills up my spine. We could see clear as day into the living room. There was a lamp on in the corner, and in the middle of the room, somewhat close to the window, was that trashy woman we saw who came and yelled at us before. She was standing still, doing nothing, just facing the window looking out at us. She had a borderline angry-looking expression. We yelled, asking for help, but when she wouldn't move, we were too creeped out to stay there and left. As we got back in the truck, about to drive to another house, my phone started vibrating. It was Mia calling me. Thank God. I picked up and asked her they were and what happened, but I could barely get a word in as Mia said there were two men with axes in their hands wearing masks over their heads walking towards them out of the woods, and that's why the girls screamed and they all ran away down the road. One of them was currently on the phone with 911, and they were waiting. It was out in the woods right on the side of the road. It wasn't long after that the call disconnected, and I wasn't able to reach him again. So we waited on the side of the road, not far from the house. When we finally saw flashing lights coming down the road, we waved them down and asked them to help us find our friends first. We drove up the road until we saw our friends come out from the woods, waving their hands. We scooped them up and followed the police back to the house. Once there, we collected all of our belongings as Mia and the girls frantically recounted what they had just gone through. Oddly enough, the Airbnb was not broken into, and none of our stuff was taken. There was no sign of any men with axes. We also told the police about the cries for help in the lake, which I believe prompted a search team to come to the scene. By then, we were already long gone from that place. We never looked back. After much persistence and battling with Airbnb and the host, we got our money back for the stay, well, most of it. None of us could ever figure out this situation, like if it was all a trap. If the calls for help from the lake were linked with the men approaching the house with the axes, and if that woman was also affiliated somehow with this. Was it just to scare us out of there, or were they really going to attack us? I don't know, and I don't care. I just don't do remote places anymore after this, and I know the girls won't either. In 2014, a man named Blair and his wife Farah were spending a weekend together on Vancouver Island, which they had done many times before. The couple has a lot of experience on the island and just camping in general. Vancouver Island provides an optimal camping setting because of its mix of scenic beaches and dense forest. The couple had many successful camping trips on the island until something truly terrifying happened to them on their final outing on the island. Blair and Farah were far from any roads or civilization, enjoying the solitude. They set up camp on a beach, a good distance from anywhere, and kept a fire going. To get to the trail leaving the beach was 1 kilometer along the beach and 2 kilometers to the road through the forest. The couple had met another camper named Claude from New Zealand, who they ran into earlier that day on the beach. Claude was planning on sleeping in his van, which he parked back up on the road. The couple invited him down to the beach for a fire, and the three shared a bottle of wine, talking amongst themselves around the fire. This is where things started to get a little creepy. The sun was starting to go down by this point, and the trio kept hearing what sounded like female voices from behind them in the bushes dividing the beach from the forest. It wasn't too dark out yet, though, so it was still possible that they were just other hikers or campers nearby, or even a group who anchored offshore and the sound was just bouncing in a weird way. All three of them could agree that they were hearing female voices. On that note, it was getting late and a little dark, so Claude said goodbye and set out to hike back to his car before it was too dark. Blair and Farah stayed by their campsite and stoked the fire because Farah was starting to get creeped out by the voices, which continued on into the darkness. It sounded like two female voices speaking, but whatever that was being said was unintelligible. It sounded to the couple like the voices were not far beyond the tree line now. They stayed up very late tending to the fire, and only when the voices had finally stopped did they decide to put out the fire and go to sleep in the tent. Before doing so, the two had scanned the cove with a flashlight several times looking for boats that could have been the source of the talking, but there was nothing in sight. It was around 3 a.m. when they laid down, finally ready to catch some sleep, but about 15 minutes after they laid down, Blair and Farah heard footsteps in the area around their campsite, over by where the fire was. They came from the direction of the bushes toward the inland behind them, a direction that was not traversable by people. The couple lay there hoping it was just a bear or any animal because the only bears on the island are black bears, which usually are very timid around people. The footsteps went from the fire, then over to the tent, then back into the woods. 5 minutes later, the footsteps came back again to the fire, and now, clear as day, there were two female voices talking gibberish very loudly. Their communication did not resemble any languages known to Blair or Farah, and they seemed to be talking over each other, having what could barely be considered a conversation at full volume in the dead of night, very far away from civilization, without using lights to navigate through the dense brush relatively quietly in a direction that seemed impossible to traverse on foot. The two voices moved from the fire pit area over to the tent, still talking at a loud volume. They stood over the tent talking for a few seconds, then went completely dead silent. They went back into the woods to never be seen or heard again. Blair and Farah lay there completely frozen and afraid for a long time. They woke up around 11 a.m. the next day because of how late they fell asleep. They packed up first thing and never returned. The couple probably made the best decision to remain quiet in the tent, not drawing attention to themselves from whoever or whatever was outside. One of my favorite hobbies has always been playing video games. When I was younger, I used to do a lot of console gaming, but in recent years, I've done most of my gaming on the PC. So, I have a setup in my bedroom in the apartment that I currently live in. It's in one corner of the room opposite my bed. Several weeks ago, I was having a gaming night with a friend. We both logged on at probably a little after 8 p.m. I was at my apartment, and he was at his apartment, so we were just gaming online. We were going to go until we got tired. I live alone in my small one-bedroom apartment, which is kind of old and on the first floor of the building. After playing online for several hours, neither of us were tired yet. At this point, I'm guessing it was around 11 p.m. That's when I thought I heard a knocking at my window behind me. I had my headset on, which is mostly noise canceling, so I couldn't hear that well, but I looked back to the window. It's probably like 15 feet from my desk and the chair I was sitting in. When I looked, I thought I saw what appeared to be a man moving away from the window. The window looks out to a small grassy area behind the apartments. Then there's a fence between the next property and a little woods before another apartment complex. In all my time living here, I had never really seen anybody out walking back there or anything, so this was kind of strange and also suspicious. The total time that I saw the guy was less than a second, though he was already moving away when I turned around and looked. I told my friend I would be back in a minute, and then I got up. I then walked over to the window and looked out of it. It was pretty dark in the little space back there, but I could see a little bit. However, I did not notice anyone there. I then left my bedroom and walked out to the kitchen, which also had a window looking out to that same general area. This had a broader view, but I still didn't see anyone. I figured that the guy was gone. This situation was kind of weird, especially with it being late at night. My only good explanation that I could think of was that possibly the man accidentally went to the wrong apartment window. He could have been trying to get somebody else's attention who he knew. I then went back to my gaming chair and sat down. I told my friend about what had happened. We chatted about it for a while and decided that it probably wasn't a big deal. However, probably 30 minutes after this or so, I remember looking back to the window. My headset was still on, so I don't remember if I heard anything or if I was just randomly turning around. When I did, though, I saw a man standing at the window. He was looking in. Because of it being dark outside, I did not really see any details of the man's face or what he looked like. Instinctively, I quickly got up from my chair. When I did, the man moved out of sight from the window. I then walked out of my bedroom into my small hallway with just a bathroom and a closet. Then to the right is the living room. It just felt safer to be away from that window. Moments later, before I returned to my bedroom or really did anything, I heard a noise. I was standing in the hallway, and there were a few sort of loud banging noises from my bedroom window. It seemed like possibly the man was going to try to break in. I heard several more loud bangs on the window, and I worried that it would break. I walked over to my door and left my apartment, going into the hallway. Then I called the police. I told them about what happened and said that I thought a man was breaking in. While I waited for the police, I went to the lobby of the apartment building near the front. I felt much better being away from my unit. The police got there minutes later. They searched my apartment and behind it. When I returned to my place, I saw that my window was actually broken and the man had gotten in. Several things were messed up. I was also missing several items. However, the man was able to escape before the police got there. At the end of the day, I was just glad that I left before he broke in. With the window being broken, I went and stayed at a friend's house for the night. The window got repaired the next day. Though I'm mad about having several of my things stolen, it was not even $100 worth of stuff. I am, however, sort of concerned that something like this will happen again. I still live in the same apartment, but luckily, nothing like this has happened since. On April 17, 1918, the SS Dummerup set sail from Portland, Oregon, bound for the South Pacific. Owned by the U.S. Shipping Board, the 270 feet, 500-ton wooden steamer would transport goods between the United States and the many Philippine islands approximately 7,000 miles to its east. Its manufacturers, the Grant Smith Porter Ship Company, had high hopes for their creation, but right away, ill omens prompted hushed concern. When the ship launched in Portland during the spring of 1918, it tumbled into the water and smashed into several houseboats on the Willamette River. The ship's captain, a hardy Scandinavian named Ola Berenson, dismissed the apprehensions of his anxious crew members, and they set sail for San Francisco during the finer climes of the late summer. The Dummerup departed the United States in September of 1918, made a stop in Hawaii, and then sailed on to Guam. Finally, on October 16th, the ship sailed out of Guam's Opera Harbor destined for the Philippine capital of Manila. Only then was it loaded up with its final cargo, which just so happened to be several thousand gallons of gasoline and a monumental shipment of trinitrotoluene, more commonly known as TNT. As the Dummerup pulled out of Opera Harbor, heavy storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Then, before long, the storm broke in earnest. The Dummerup crashed through the roaring waves of the Philippine Sea, its crew battling the elements to keep her afloat. Then suddenly, disaster struck. A bolt of lightning streaked through the sky, striking the Dumaru's wooden deck and setting off a chain reaction that ignited both the shipment of gasoline and the crates full of dynamite. In the years that followed, survivor Theron Bean stated that the forwardmost portion of the ship simply erupted into flame following the bright white flash. Soon after, the call went out to abandon ship. The ship's crew rushed aboard its 3 life vessels, which consisted of a small raft and 2 boats. But in their panic, the men failed to evenly distribute themselves between the 3 vessels. This meant that while one of the lifeboats departed with just 9 people aboard and 11 empty seats, the other became dangerously overloaded with over 30 terrified sailors hanging on for dear life. Soon after, the 3 vessels were separated by rough seas. On October 26, 1918, the Sunday Oregonian reported that Captain Berenson, his second mate, and 3 crew members had been found alive and well. They had been picked up by a transport ship just 9 days after the Dumaru exploded. Their quest for survival was over. Their shipmates, on the other hand, were not so fortunate. Theon Bean, who found himself crammed aboard the boat of 32, stated that they rode through the night until finally, the rising sun revealed Guam on the horizon. Yet, the Dumaru's survivors were horrified when a sudden change of wind and currents sent their boat off course, floating aimlessly in the Philippine Sea. The men's hopes were reignited by the sudden appearance of a passing steamer. They began frantically rowing in its direction, waving and shouting as they went, but frustratingly, they remained unspotted as it sailed past them and into the distance. For the next few days, the sailors hoped and prayed for favorable winds. But as time passed, the situation grew critical. Their daily rations allowed for only 2 tablespoons of water and 1 piece of hardtack. Then, after 7 days of drifting, they found themselves too weak to row. Around 2 weeks into their ordeal, the first of the survivors began to die from exposure. 3 days later, they ran out of hardtack, while the heavens had failed to provide them with a single drop of rain. Some grew so thirsty that they began to drink salt water. All who did so died in agony just hours after their first sip. Other savvier sailors fashioned a makeshift catchment device, otherwise known as an evaporator, using their shoes, the boat's oars, along with some spare wood they'd managed to chip away from it, with which to fuel a small fire. It was a creative but futile attempt to replenish their water supplies. Ultimately, they decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. After a brief but confrontational discussion, one of the starving sailors took a rubber hose from a bailing pump and fashioned it into a makeshift fishing line. He then took a knife and began carving off pieces of his dead shipmate's flesh. After tying the meat to the improvised fishing line, he used it as bait to attract nearby schools of fish. Eventually, a group of dolphins passed by. After luring one ever closer with the tempting taste of human flesh, the sailors speared it, killed it, and butchered it. Theon Bean later wrote that the dolphin's meat and moisture were warmly welcomed but scarcely commended the method by which it was obtained. Finally, on the 24th day of their ordeal, the survivors of the SS Dumaru began to drift towards land. There had been weak celebration upon its sighting, and for the first time in weeks, the men felt some semblance of hope return. Little did they know, the worst was yet to come. As their lifeboat approached white tropical sands, choppy waves caused it to capsize. The surviving sailors were tossed among a seabed strewn with jagged skeletal coral, inflicting terrible gashes and scrapes to their tender sunburned skin. Some men were simply too weak to swim to shore and drowned among the coral, failing at the final hurdle. In a tragic turn of events, of the 32 men who climbed into the Dumaru lifeboat on the day it exploded, only 14 of them lived to tell the tale. Those that returned were treated as minor celebrities and, like Theon Bean, were venerated by a sympathetic media that was already buzzing with excitement over the Great War in Europe. They were treated as men of grit, will, and determination, while those who died were revered as great Americans, men who braved wild frontiers not just for their own enrichment but for the benefit of their families and their nation. Theon Bean claimed that upon their passing, his fallen comrades were given respectful burial at sea. But the truth was deeply and disturbingly different. Almost 12 years later, On January 1st of the year 1930, a man named Eliel Thomas published a book which stunned the American maritime community. It was entitled The Wreck of the Doomuroo, A Story of Cannibalism. In his book, Mr. Thomas claimed that after extensive interviews with one of the ship's survivors, who wished to remain anonymous, it was quite certain that the shipwrecked sailors of the SS Doomuroo had resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. The book caused outrage and indignation among vast swaths of the American public, so much so that a reporter from the New York Times was tasked with verifying Mr. Thomas's account. This reporter subsequently discovered that not only was Mr. Thomas's source a reliable one, being the Doomuroo's assistant engineer Fred Harmon, but his narrative was identical to the U.S. Navy's own official version of the incident. According to the report taken from a U.S. naval base in the Philippine Islands, 4 of the Doomuroo survivors passed away on the 18th day of their ordeal. One of these men, the ship's first engineer, had supposedly permitted his fellow sailors to consume his flesh upon his passing, and so they did. After carving off pieces of the dead man's flesh, the surviving sailors boiled the meat in a kerosene can. It tasted good, the assistant engineer reportedly stated. Everyone seemed to feel a little better after eating. The next day, the survivors ate a little more, but this time Harmon reported that the amount of salt in the meat made everyone sick and crazy. Harmon also stated that the proposal to cannibalize the dead was the suggestion of a Greek sailor he referred to as George. Wielding a hatchet, George was alleged to have demanded that they consume the flesh of the fallen. "We're all dying," he reported. George yelled, "Cook the chief or I'll do it myself." Finally, on the orders of the Doomuroo first mate, George the Greek prepared the flesh of the dead men for consumption and did so under the watchful eye of a lieutenant named E.V. Holmes. The lieutenant went ahead and ordered the Greek to place small parts of flesh on the wooden boat bailer that was shaped like a large sugar scoop and then wash them in the sea. Harmon said afterward, the wooden bailer was passed around to all. Harmon went on to state that George the Greek ate first and then, I quote, offered the flesh to Holmes, who took it and ate it, thereby showing the rest of us that he desired us to do likewise. We ourselves had come around to George's way of thinking, and we decided to go right on with what the Greek started. Though the men had initially been horrified at the idea of eating their crewmates, they eventually agreed that it was, and I quote, the only possible means of saving our lives, and for our comrades, it was a fate not much worse than to be eaten by sharks. After eating the head engineer, they allegedly also ate a Hawaiian mess boy who had grown so weak that he couldn't move. Following the publication of Eliel Thomas's highly controversial account, the Doomuroo survivors admitted that the reports of cannibalism were true. However, the Connecticut Examiner went on to report that, quote, speculation still persisted about several disappearances, speculating that some men jumped overboard and became shark food rather than risk being eaten by their comrades, and grisly unsubstantiated rumors of casting lots before an unlucky chief engineer and Hawaiian mess boy were killed, cooked, and eaten. Reports of cannibalism and the allegations of voluntary deaths include details that are beyond horrifying. But perhaps one of the more subtly chilling aspects of this case is that had it not been for a shift in the wind or had the passing steamer noticed the small lifeboat and come to its rescue, this grisly and terrifying episode might well have been averted entirely. This happened when I was in my late 30s on a fishing trip to celebrate a promotion I had received from my job. Throughout my young adult years, I've always been out on the water and never once had come across anything or had a reason to be afraid. However, this one night of the trip took my fascination with fishing and crushed it. The night of my trip, I had stopped my boat to save fuel and found myself on my boat watching over the ocean. It was a quiet and calm night, and there was no land for miles, just the sound of the calm waves hitting the boat. So there I was, sitting on top of my boat somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, when I saw something. I got out my binoculars, and with the light from the moon, I was able to see something bobbing along the water. Because of how dark it was too difficult to see just what it was. My first thought was to get my wife, who was sleeping, but I didn't want to wake her. The closer it got, I then made it out to be a raft of some type, tied together with bamboo and a tarp strapped to it. Upon this raft was not a single soul. The chances of coming across a raft this far out at sea were small enough. In this part of the ocean, the scary part about this was thinking about the person or people who once sailed that raft, why they sailed, and how they met their fate. That is what stuck with me. This is a story I'm not proud of, mostly for my naivety. When I was in middle school and early high school, I didn't know how to talk to girls at all at school, but that's a lot of boys in middle school. I wasn't shy in general. I had friends and did normal things an 8th grader would do. I just had never kissed a girl or anything. Some of my friends at the time claimed they had already gone further than that with girls, and I was starting to feel pressure. But I was still having trouble approaching girls in that way. The mentality went from boys making fun of girls to suddenly liking them in a matter of like a year. I was a pretty big gamer in middle school and early high school. This was when I was in 8th grade. I was like 13. My voice was still probably a bit prepubescent sounding. It was 2009. I played a lot of console games and computer MMORPG games. My favorite console games at the time were GTA 4 and Call of Duty, and my favorite computer game was this MMORPG called Ganu. It was this online game where you would level up by killing monsters, and the more you leveled up, the higher level monsters and hunting grounds you'd be able to tackle. The online community in this game was very active, and there were tons of players. My older brother used to play it a little bit too. I played it more for sure though. I was in a guild and town and everything. I don't remember how it happened, but I befriended this female player who was a higher level than me. Her username was Pokemon. Anytime I'd sign in and she was on, she'd message me and vice versa. We would join parties together, which meant we'd share EXP on whatever monsters we killed, and we just chatted for hours. She knew a lot about me, including my age and my town and some personal family details she would open up to me too. Eventually, she told me her name was Karina. It was weird feeling such a connection with a girl when really, I knew nothing about her appearance or her voice. It truly was like having a pen pal, but better. It was interesting enough that we both lived in Texas state. She lived about an hour from me. After a few weeks, or maybe even a month, we started talking about maybe meeting one day. To do this, though, we'd have to exchange numbers. At the time, I didn't actually have a cell phone yet. I only had an iPod Touch. However, I was able to download a texting app that allowed me to send messages to people with cell phones. Through this app, I was able to send her a picture of myself. It was definitely this cringy 8th grade boy selfie of me trying to look good looking. She called me cute, and then she sent back a picture of herself. She looked a couple of years older than me, like 15, which was the age she told me she was. Based on the picture, I found her very attractive. This was around the time our messages became more flirtatious and romantic. But we were both minors, so neither of us could just drive an hour away. However, she apparently had a solution for this. She told me her sister had friends that lived around me, and she could probably get a ride to me. This was exciting news for my little 13-year-old self. I wanted to wait for a day and night when my parents wouldn't be home, so I'd have the house to myself. This was about a week later, I believe. My parents were going to the Hamptons for the whole weekend, so it would just be my brother and me home. My brother was 18, so I asked him to please just go out for the night with friends so that I could be alone with Karina. I gave Karina my address and told her to come that Saturday whenever she wanted. She said she'd be coming a little later, like at night. She didn't give me an exact time. At that point, we still had never spoken on the phone. I still hadn't heard her voice. I was so nervous all day that I couldn't even play video games. I was busy cleaning my room, making things look cool, fixing my appearance, and even rehearsing things to say in the initial moments of meeting. Then I got a message from Karina saying she's here. I sprang up and ran to the front door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see anyone. She then said, "You can come out to the front door." I opened the door and stepped onto the front porch. I looked around, and the street was dark and quiet, no cars, no people. I went back inside and shut the door. I messaged her back saying, "I don't see you." She replied, "Oh, I must have the wrong house. Give me a minute." That was a bit weird. I locked the door and sat on the living room couch, nervously waiting and playing games on my iPod. I got a message from her again. She said she's here and to come outside. I replied, "Ring the bell so I know you're at the right house." Then the doorbell rang. My nerves really set in. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and didn't see anyone. I said, "Karina." Through the peephole, I saw a hand reach towards the door and knock. I said, "Karina," again as I kept looking through the peephole. Everything felt like it instantly crumbled on top of me as this bald, creepy-looking short guy stepped in front of the peephole and then said through the door, "Hey, it's Pokemon. I want to talk." I ran away from the door with my hands over my mouth, truly speechless. The person I'd been talking to all this time was a creepy grown man. I was disgusted and scared. I went to call my brother's cell phone, he didn't pick up. The doorbell kept ringing. I went to my bedroom and locked myself in. I held the house phone in my grasp, considering calling my parents but too embarrassed to do so. My room was the only other room in the house with the lights on. I have a big window in my room that overlooks the whole side yard of our corner house. I turned off my lamp and slightly kinked the blind just a crack, and I saw that guy on the other side trying to look in. He started to knock on the window and said through the closed window how much of a connection we clearly have and that we could at least be friends. I responded with nothing. I called my brother again, and he picked up this time. I said, "Please come home right now." The Karina person was a grown man the entire time, and he's at my window right now. My brother's always been pretty big, even as a teenager. I'd feel safer with him being here. He said he was coming home with his friends right now. We stayed on the phone so I could tell him if anything happened. I ran to my parents' bedroom upstairs and hid there. The man was blowing up my message app, saying he would like to talk and that there was a reason he had to lie about who he was. When my brother got home, he told me he saw the guy outside. My brother and his 3 friends confronted the creepy short man outside. I went outside then to watch the 4 of them intimidate the man, calling him a sicko. The man's defense was that he was concerned for my well-being, inviting strangers from online over, and that this was supposed to be a learning lesson. I refuted this claim by asking him why he would say that we could be good friends at my window when my brother and his friends started pushing the man. He started quickly walking to his car. My brother kicked the guy's tail light while one of his friends threw a rock at his window. He sped off down the road, never to be seen again. This was humiliating and disturbing, but at the same time, I was really grateful for my brother and his friends coming to my aid. They potentially saved me from a seriously sick creep breaking into the house. It's still painful and uncomfortable realizing all that time I spent opening up to who I thought was a girl my own age on a game was some creepy grown man with a different agenda. In the heart of the dense forest stood a lake, its waters dark and foreboding, shrouded in mystery and fear. Local legends whispered of a curse upon the lake, warning fishermen and adventurers alike to stay far away. But curiosity, as it often does, beckoned the bold to its shores. Among those drawn to the lake was Andrew, a seasoned angler with a thirst for adventure that overshadowed any superstition. Armed with his fishing gear and determination, he ventured into the woods, guided by stories of monstrous catches and whispered horrors. As he reached the edge of the lake, an eerie mist rose from its surface, obscuring what lay beneath. Ignoring the chill that crept up his spine, Andrew cast his line into the murky depths, eager to test his skills against whatever lurked below. Hours passed with little success, and the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. Just as Andrew prepared to call it a day, his line suddenly went taut, pulling him forward with unexpected force. With a grunt of surprise, he struggled to reel in his catch, the water churning and bubbling as whatever he had hooked fought against him. Heart pounding, Andrew finally managed to haul his prize onto the shore, only to stagger back in horror at what lay before him. It was no fish that writhed and thrashed at his feet, but a grotesque abomination straight from the nightmares of ancient lore. Its twisted form was a grotesque amalgamation of scales and tentacles, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence that sent shivers down Andrew's spine. In a panic, he stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled to escape the creature's grasp. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward with lightning speed, its tentacles wrapping around Andrew's legs and dragging him screaming into the depths below. This past New Year's was my and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year, we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snow plowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped, and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snow plowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark. We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask if they or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back. This time, we actually drove up the driveway towards the top of the hill. Part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up, and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in a hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie with champagne. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 2 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on, and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. Once again, we sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute mind when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. Then, soon, we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer who did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked, and again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locking all the doors again, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving. While we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 2 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater all that time. It was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. There's a nice hidden lake a short walk away from my house in Parson Field, Maine. I've been going fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's hidden away from any roads or houses, it has perfect privacy, and I would always be the only one out on the lake fishing. In fact, I would leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier than lugging the thing back and forth through my house to the lake anytime I wanted to use it. I would leave it leaning up against this huge tree every time. The kayak is heavy enough to not fall over from a windstorm or anything. I also leave it covered to prevent critters from taking refuge inside. It was a warm summer's evening. I was out on the lake already for about an hour and I'd caught a few trout already, which I'd thrown into the cooler. It was dusk at this point. The little bit of light left in the sky was disappearing behind the trees. I was going to bring it in soon, and just then, I heard sounds from the edge of the lake. I turned and saw someone standing at the edge of the water, tipping a barrel of some kind over, pouring its contents into the lake. It looked to me like they were polluting the lake with something. I took it upon myself to yell out, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me and then ran into the woods with the contents of the barrel still pouring into the water. I looked more closely at the liquid being poured out into the lake, and it looked like a dark red liquid, though it was dark out, so I can't say with 100% certainty if it was red, but it was very dark. I felt a sense of unease creep up throughout my body. I decided I wanted to leave. I'm a big nature guy though, and seeing people littering or polluting the environment makes me sick. I genuinely couldn't resist shouting something out to that person, but I didn't feel comfortable here any longer. I planned on reporting this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled the kayak back to my usual spot. I took all of my gear off the kayak before pulling it out of the water. As I was putting the cover over the kayak, I heard one single snap of something not far away, like the crunch of something under a person's shoe. I turned and was about to say, "Who's there?" but I decided against it. I finished covering the kayak quicker than I ever had before. I didn't even bother standing it up to lean on the tree this time. I left it on the ground. I picked up my gear and cooler and started quickly walking out of the woods and out to the road which led to my house. It was only a couple minutes of a walk and I was back home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time, thinking someone was behind me. I put my gear in the shed real quick, then went inside. I never locked the doors so quickly. I was genuinely spooked. I rinsed off the trout and put them in the fridge, planning on cooking them tomorrow. Tonight, I just heated up some leftovers. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread that I was feeling the entire walk back to the house returned in an instant, and my suspicion that I was being followed home was basically confirmed. I mean, who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, my car was in the driveway, whoever it was knew I was in here. I had all the shades closed though, so nobody could look inside. They knocked on the door again. The microwave beeped as the timer hit 0. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it. All the windows were cracked open, and a moment later, there was a knock now on the window, and a man's voice said through the window, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier." I'd just like to explain myself. There was absolutely no chance I was opening the door to this person. For them to stalk me to my house told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling, "Hello," through it. I decided to acknowledge him now that he was getting more aggressive. I yelled, "Yo, leave or I'll call the police." I intended to either way, but it was still a threat to get him to leave. The man responded calmly now, saying, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. At this point, I shut and locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number, detailing both the barrel being dumped into the lake and the man coming to my house. I also made an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection. Making these 2 reports honestly made me feel a little better about going to sleep that night. But thank God I'm a light sleeper. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I immediately sprang out of my bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard someone's attempt at quiet footsteps coming up the creaky wooden steps. I had my Glock loaded in hand as I stood behind my dresser right by my closet, aiming at the door. I heard very slow creeping towards my door. My bedroom door is closest to the stairs, so it was naturally the first door that they would approach. And sure enough, I heard the doorknob slowly press down and then the door pushed open. I saw nothing but the man's silhouette enter the room. I flicked on the lamp next to me so he could see my gun, and I screamed, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands in the air and seemed for a second to be motioning for me to calm down. He had a small blade in his hand. I told him to drop it, but then he said calmly, "I'm leaving," and he turned and ran for downstairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he clearly took the chance on me being too afraid to pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I ran downstairs to lock the front door right away and then called 911. My living room window was shattered, glass was all over the floor. I kept my sight on that broken window until the police officer showed up. I had to explain that I already made a non-emergency report of what happened earlier, in fear of waiting too long by morning for the barrel to be gone in the darkness. I went with 2 of the officers who showed up to my house to where I saw that man dumping the barrel into the lake, but after 20 minutes of walking around looking for it, it was gone. The man must have made sure not to leave it behind. I gave my best description of the man to the police for their report. The man was a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room all night with my gun next to me, watching TV. No way in hell was I going to sleep with a broken window and some nut job out there. At dawn, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. My brother Azaria stayed at the house while my other brother and I went to Home Depot to get the window and parts. Azaria stayed at the house with me for a few nights till things cooled down. My not-so-wild theory is that the barrel contained human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that man follow me home and then break into my house to potentially murder me? Trust your gut if something feels wrong. I knew if I opened my door to that man, something terrible might have happened to me. Out upon the open sea, where the horizon stretches on forever and the depths conceal untold secrets, sailed the trawler-cursed Endeavor, a vessel steeped in legend and whispered tales of woe. For generations, it had plied the waters in search of riches untold, its crew bound by a dark pact that none dared to break. Among those who called the cursed trawler home was Captain Drake, a weathered seafarer with a haunted look in his eyes and a past shrouded in mystery. For years, he had served as master of the ship, guiding her through storms and tempests with a skill that bordered on the supernatural. But as the years wore on, the crew began to whisper of strange happenings aboard the trawler, whispers of voices in the night, of shadows that moved of their own accord, and of a curse that had followed them across the 7 seas. Undeterred by such tales, Captain Drake pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind the curse that plagued his ship. But with each passing day, the supernatural occurrences grew more frequent and more terrifying, until even the bravest among them trembled at the thought of what lurked in the darkness below. It was on a moonless night, with the wind howling and the waves crashing against the hull, that the curse finally revealed its true form. As the crew gathered on deck, their faces pale with fear, a monstrous shape rose from the depths, its eyes burning with a hatred that chilled the soul. With a deafening roar, the creature lashed out, its tentacles snaking across the deck with deadly precision. Panic ensued as the crew fought for their lives, their screams lost in the fury of the storm that raged around them. But amidst the chaos, Captain Drake stood firm, his eyes blazing with a determination born of desperation. With a mighty roar, he rallied his crew, leading them in a final desperate assault against the creature that threatened to drag them all to a watery grave. And as dawn broke over the horizon, the cursed trawler sailed on, battered but unbroken, its crew united in their victory over the darkness that had sought to claim them. For though the curse may linger still, they knew that as long as they stood together, they would never again fear the horrors that lurked beneath the waves. Before I get started telling you about the worst night of my life, which was actually supposed to be the best night of my life, I have to give you a little bit of backstory to make it make sense. You see, the man I ended up marrying is the exact opposite of the men I dated in my younger years. I'm not ashamed to say that I'm a recovered drug addict, but that should also tell you something about the people I used to hang around and, at some points, date. I wasn't raised in the nicest of neighborhoods, and I didn't have the kind of parents that cared what I did or where I went. I was lucky if I came home and there was actually food in the fridge. I ended up dropping out at 14 and moving in with my boyfriend at the time. He was 23. Yeah, I know what you're all thinking. A 23-year-old with a 14-year-old girl is gross and in no way okay. But I was 14. I thought it was cool that an older guy wanted to be with me. My parents didn't even question where I was going when they saw me moving things out of the house, so I just figured everything was fine. My friends from school kept telling me not to move in with him, but I thought they were just jealous. So I did it anyway and cut all of them out of my life. Now, we'll call this guy that I moved in with Danny. Danny was a meth addict. I say was, but honestly, I'm 99% sure that he still is. The house I moved into was completely disgusting, with rotting floors, mold everywhere, and random people coming in and out all day and during all hours of the night. Part of me regretted moving in with him, but I was stubborn and didn't want to prove my friends right. Besides, life with Danny was fun, or so my 14-year-old self thought. We would smoke all the time. He got me whatever I wanted, by shoplifting, of course, and he was nice to me. Well, not actually nice to me. He would compliment me and tell me how amazing I was and that he loved me, but at the same time, he would hit me whenever he got high. He always apologized after, and I always forgave him. After all, I had nowhere to go, and he always reminded me that no one would ever love me as much as he did. Well, I bet you can guess what happened next. I eventually got hooked on meth. I was 15 when he first asked me if I wanted to try it. I said no a few times, but he kept pressuring me and begging me just to try it, and I finally gave in. I couldn't describe the exact feeling to you even if I wanted to. All I knew was that I needed to feel that feeling again. I think I finally realized I had a problem about a year in when I couldn't stop. I had to have it. I couldn't even go half a day without getting high, and it was all I thought about, and it completely consumed me. One day, I ran into one of my childhood friends who was a few years older than me at the store when I was about 18 years old. She just gasped when she saw me. Her mouth was wide open as she stared at me, and I knew why. I looked horrible. My teeth were rotting, my hair was disgusting, the clothes I wore were ratty. I was gross, and I have no problem admitting that. It is what it is. When she finally managed to speak, all she said was, "What happened to you?" At that moment, all I felt was shame. I wanted to shrivel up in a little ball and disappear. We actually ended up talking for a few hours that day, and for some reason, I told her everything that had happened in the few years since we last talked. She listened to me, hugged me, and told me that she wanted to help me. Her husband worked at a rehabilitation center, and she was sure that she could get me in if I was willing. I honestly didn't think that I was ready for that, but I also knew that I probably would never be ready. I had this opportunity right in front of me to get help, and I knew so many people didn't have that, so I took it. I agreed to go to rehab. I left Danny that night, and when he found out where I was going, anger didn't even begin to cover how he felt. He beat me, threw all my stuff on the grass outside the house, lit it on fire, and told me dying was the only way I would ever be rid of him. I said nothing. I called my friend, and she and her husband were at the house in just under 10 minutes. Danny screamed and yelled as I got in the car. As we were driving away, he told me my life would be nothing without him. I left and I never looked back. I got through rehab and have been clean for the past 10 years. I won't lie to you and tell you that it's been easy, it hasn't. I was instructed by one of my therapists in rehab to move out of state so I wouldn't be surrounded by the same people and places that influenced me in the first place. So, I did as she said and moved to Montana. I went back to school, got my GED, and eventually went to college and graduated with a teaching degree. I got a job at the local elementary school teaching history and met the man I now call my husband. I never knew that I could be so happy, that a man could treat me so well, but there I was, the happiest I'd ever been in my life, with a stable job and in a serious, incredible relationship. When he asked me to marry him, I was overjoyed. I was so excited. I began planning immediately, and of course, the guest list would be on the small side, but that wasn't important. I was just happy to be getting married to the man of my dreams. The day the wedding rolled around, I was nervous, not cold feet nervous, just nervous and excited for the day and hoping that it would be as amazing as I thought it would be. I was wrong, and I'll tell you why. The ceremony went perfectly. We said our vows, everyone cried, including me, and it was amazing. It was everything I had dreamed of and more. Then came the reception. We booked a fairly small outdoor venue and paid to have those big party tents set up in case it started to rain and we would still be covered. People began making their toasts, and when the time came, my husband and I began our first dance together as husband and wife. As I held on to my husband's arm while we swayed to the music, I swore I was going crazy when I saw him. I knew it had to be a dumb joke my mind was playing on me, but it was no joke. He was really there, and I froze, terrified, as I watched him make his way toward me carrying something that was covered by a blood-soaked towel. I couldn't speak. I don't know why I couldn't, but no words would come out no matter how much I tried. Maybe it was a panic attack, but either way, I was desperately looking around at other people, hoping they noticed what was scaring me so bad. My husband was whispering something in my ear, but I couldn't even hear him. Everything was being tuned out, and the only thing I could focus on was Danny getting closer and closer to me with every step he took. Finally, someone noticed, and I was relieved when I saw my husband's brother get out of his seat and physically stop Danny from getting any closer to me. And that's when he did it. He uncovered what he was carrying and threw it right in my face. It hit me hard. Whatever it was heavy and wet and hit me with so much force I was on the ground in seconds. I couldn't believe what was happening. I looked down and noticed that I was covered in blood. The room started spinning, and I started hyperventilating. I could hear Danny screaming, but at that point, I couldn't focus enough on anything to tell what he was saying, and finally, I just passed out. When I woke up, I was in the back of an ambulance, getting my dress cut off so they could look for wounds. They weren't exactly sure if the blood was mine or if it all came from the pig's head. Yes, you read that right. Danny had actually thrown a severed pig's head directly at my face. I had a few cuts on my face from where the head hit me and had unfortunately swallowed some of the blood that had forced its way into my mouth on impact. My husband apparently insisted I be taken to the hospital to test for any diseases I may have gotten from it. After I passed out, a bunch of men in my husband's family tackled Danny to the ground and beat him severely until he was bloody and unconscious. When the police got there, they also just ended up taking him to the hospital as well, where he was treated for internal injuries from the beating. I was fine apart from the mental trauma and a couple of scrapes and bruises from where I was hit. My husband and I had a second ceremony a few months later, much smaller, at his parents' house to try to make up for the day that had been ruined for both of us, and it was perfect. It's just how I wanted my wedding day to be remembered. Now, Danny was sentenced to 5 years in prison with 5 years probation after his eventual release. I was relieved when I heard how long his sentence was. The mental trauma that I have has been awful, but my husband always makes me feel safe. He assured me that he would never let anything happen to me like that again, and I believed him. It wasn't his fault. We've been married now for 5 years, and I figured I'd tell this story now as Danny is set to be released in the coming months. Lately, all I do is pray to God that he isn't mad enough to pull something like that again or do something even worse. New York City trains are pretty crazy. I've been groped and harassed, and I've seen things that I don't ever want to see again. My best friend and I were neighbors living in Upper Manhattan. It was summertime, and it was pretty late. It was around 8:30-ish, and we wanted to go to the west side to get some milkshakes because we always liked to go out late for little adventures. Of course, my parents didn't want us to go out late, but we kept pushing it, and we ended up going. In order to get to where we wanted to go, we had to take the subway. As we're coming back, it was already 9:30-ish, so we expected to get back home around 10. The train arrived, and my best friend and I hopped in. The train car was empty, so we sat on the chairs with 2 seats. As we arrived at the next stop, a man came into the same car. We didn't think anything of it until the man sat right across from us. Keep in mind, the train car was nearly empty, and he could have picked literally any other seat but decided to sit across from us. Of course, my friend and I thought that was weird, so we texted each other saying we were going to move to the next car when we got to the next stop. As we were heading to the next stop, we quickly ran out of the train and ran to a different car. We just kind of laughed it off until our smiles slowly turned into worried faces when we saw the same man coming into the new car we had just moved to. Obviously, my friend and I felt completely uncomfortable. We moved all the way down to the opposite end of the car, and the man did the same exact thing. Keep in mind, the man himself didn't look creepy. He looked pretty average, which honestly made me really surprised. But my friend and I quickly moved to the next car once we got to the next stop. We were pretty scared because we were only 15 years old, and we were females on a subway. Train going back home alone around 10 o'clock. I don't really remember how we lost the man, but luckily we did. We quickly ran back home after we got off our stop, also making sure we weren't being followed. We didn't tell our parents because we knew they wouldn't let us out again, so we just kept it to ourselves. Nothing crazy like this ever happened again to us, but now we know to be more careful taking the subway home. For anyone that comes to New York and takes the subway, please be careful because you really never know who's gonna follow you. I've been a night owl my whole life, so I work night shifts exclusively. I really don't work well with other people, whether they're my coworkers or not, so I picked a job I could do completely on my own. I became a nighttime janitor for my local school district after I graduated from high school. Schools have always had nightly cleaning as part of health codes in most areas, but obviously, in recent years, it's become much more important. My first job was in a fairly large K-12 school. There were a couple of daytime custodians as well, but at night it was just me and one other person splitting the school down the middle. My coworker and I barely ever interacted, which I appreciated a lot. Every single night, all the floors get mopped or vacuumed, every desk, table, and door handle is disinfected, and every toilet, urinal, and sink also gets cleaned. It takes a full 8-hour shift to accomplish, and for that entire time, I don't talk to a single person. It's great, honestly. Most of my coworkers are women, and they don't want me talking to them either. When I tell people about my job, a lot of them think the hardest part is cleaning up after the messes left by the students. For the most part, I guess they are right, but I always tell them I would rather plunge and clean 10 clogged and traumatized toilets every single night than ever have to work directly with another human being all day long, especially a horde of minors. These days, there's one example I give of why I say that. It was the night after Halloween. I came in from my usual shift and got started without even saying hello to my coworker. We started on opposite ends and met in the middle, so we would only see each other when we were finishing up. The first hour was mostly normal except for one obvious thing out of the ordinary. I always keep my music at a low volume on my headphones, but from outside them, I kept hearing things. Usually, all the other faculty are gone by 8 p.m., but sometimes there's somebody who stays late. I couldn't decide what I was hearing through my music, but I wasn't in the mood to turn it off, so I just ignored it. A little while later, I took a break from mopping to change the water in the bucket. I was gone for about 5 minutes, but on my way back to where I stopped, I walked past one of the hallways I had just mopped and noticed the wet floor sign had fallen over. For legal reasons, I had to step over the wet floor and stand it back up, then mop back over my tracks. Annoyed, I walked over to it but froze for a moment when something else caught my eye. There was another set of tracks in the water, leading to and from the sign. They were little footprints, something a kid would make. After I stood the sign back up, I followed the tracks, knowing I would have to mop over those too, basically redoing the whole hallway. The tracks ran all the way to the end, where there was a flight of stairs up to the second floor. From there, they dried up pretty quickly. I stormed up the stairs and got to the second floor, but nobody was there. I took my phone out of my pocket and paused my music so I would be able to hear if anyone was running around. Right as I looked down, I saw a flash of movement at the end of the hallway. I also heard a bunch of footsteps echoing across the empty school, so I started making my way to the end of the hall. By the time I got there, I still couldn't see anyone, but then I heard a little kid laughing. It felt like I was in a horror movie, but at that point, I was more annoyed than scared. I stood there looking around for a few seconds until I heard a crash from the first floor. I rushed downstairs and nearly flipped my lid when I saw the mop bucket I had just refilled was knocked over. The water was spilling everywhere in a huge pool. I absolutely swore my head off as I went back to the nearest janitor's closet for a dry mop and a bunch of towels. It took me half an hour to clean up that mess and then another 15 minutes to redo the hallway that got messed up, which meant my break was down to 15 minutes. However, I was so pissed off that I walked to the other side of the school and interrupted my coworker to ask if she had been messing with me. She looked completely dumbfounded and innocent. She asked if I was all right or needed any help, but to that, I just walked away. I set up again and got back to work. Another hour passed, and I managed to make up some lost progress. I was angrily powering through it, debating in my head the whole time about what I should do. I thought about reporting it to the school or maybe just calling the police myself, but in the end, I figured I would seem crazy to everyone, just like I did to my coworker, so nothing happened. Again, until 11 o'clock, out of nowhere, the lights shut off in the whole school. It was pitch black for about 3 seconds until the emergency lights turned on, giving everything a reddish hue. It came as a shock to me, and to be honest, I was worried. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction or maybe some kids messing around, but my mind was going to all sorts of possibilities. I had keys to the electrical room where the light switches were, and I was the closest to it, so I stopped what I was doing and marched over. I was pissed off about losing more time and missing out on my entire break. But halfway there, something pushed those concerns out of my head. I heard the most blood-curdling scream of my life, the panic shriek of my coworker echoing endlessly. I stopped in my tracks, feeling like I had just been hit by an electric shock. Seconds later, I heard the sound of a door opening really loudly, like someone was ramming through it from the inside. I hoped it was my coworker escaping and not somebody else making their way into the school. I forced myself to keep going and finally made it to the electrical room. I was right outside the door trying to find the right key when I noticed that it was already cracked open. I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might see, and a shape appeared in front of me, standing unnaturally in the darkness. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone. I gave up on trying to turn on the lights and instead reached over for my phone in my pocket. However, as soon as I moved, the figure bolted forward and slammed the door in my face. I cursed and jumped back, stumbling until my back hit the wall behind me. Once I regained my balance, I started running. I wanted to leave, but for once in my life, I thought about the well-being of somebody else and ran to the other side of the school to find my coworker. After checking a few of her hallways, I finally found her mop bucket sitting alone in the middle of the floor next to a bathroom. Without hesitation, I rushed over to it, hoping not to see any evidence that she had been hurt. Nothing seemed unusual except for the fact that she was nowhere to be found. I looked all around in the dim lighting, but as far as I could tell, I was alone. But not completely alone. The sound of a laughing child echoed in the distance again, striking fear into my chest. I clutched the handle of the mop, for lack of anything else to defend myself with, and lifted it out of the bucket, holding the end of the handle out like a spear. I faced the direction of the laughter, looking down the hallway so intently I got tunnel vision. In a moment of sheer terror, someone whispered, "Hello," into my ear. I turned around and, without thinking, jabbed the handle of the mop into their chest with all my might. I heard a grunt as the person who snuck up on me hit the ground and vomited only a second later. I shouted at them to tell me who they were, but then they started to cry. I could tell they were trying to hold it back, but they couldn't. Gradually, my eyes made out what I was looking at. It was a student kneeling on the floor. Suddenly, all my fear of danger was replaced with the fear of losing my job for hitting a student. However, as things shook out over the next few days, it turned out all right. Two twins in the 9th grade and their little brother got the idea to keep the spirit of Halloween going and prank the overnighters in the school by hiding in the lockers. There was one set of lockers in the whole building that wasn't in use and had no locks or ties on them, and those kids were skinny enough to fit in there and hide. After doing their after-school activities, they managed to avoid being expelled, probably from crying a lot. The school district understood my actions and let me keep my job, but I was transferred to a different school. All in all, this is why I don't like people, especially kids. Nowadays, I don't camp nearly as much as I used to. I'm 24, and ever since I was young, I've been into hiking. Now, I get hiking isn't all that appealing to most people, but because of where I live, it's pretty easy to get into. You don't have to travel all that far for a pretty stunning scenic view. I try to find a new trail to hike every weekend. Typically, I'll hike alone, so I always keep a knife in my backpack for protection against wildlife. Should it ever come to that, though, in all my years of hiking, I've never once had to actually use it. In fact, I've never run into any dangerous situation while hiking. Well, at least up until a few days ago. I was driving to a heavily forested hiking trail I'd never been to before. Now, I hike in the afternoon, and this happened around the time of year where the days were starting to get shorter. In other words, the sun was setting earlier and earlier each day. This was a key detail that I had completely forgotten about prior to leaving. Only after I started driving to the place did I realize it would be completely dark outside before I would even be able to finish my hike. A decision I still regret making is deciding to do the hike anyway. I got a bad feeling about it right when I started. Fast forward a few hours, and I was now about 85% finished with the route I picked out. By this point, it was almost completely dark. I had a flashlight, but still, the whole scene was pretty eerie. This portion of the trail was deep in the forest. It was so dense with trees that the moonlight could barely even find its way through. Don't get me wrong, it was beautiful scenery in the day, but alone at night, it was nothing short of disturbing. It was then that I was really starting to regret my decision to carry out the hike. That's when I saw light up ahead on the trail. As soon as I shined my flashlight in its direction, it immediately got turned off. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't exactly turn back, so I was pretty much forced to go directly towards where it had been. In the back of my mind, I knew the chances of it being another hiker in the dark were slim to none. Eventually, I reached where the light came from. There was no one. Instead, there was a large duffel bag lying on the ground. I began scanning the trees with my flashlight. That's when a large, probably 6.5-foot man stepped out from behind one of the trees. My body completely froze up. There I stood, like a deer in headlights, shining my light on the guy. He then slowly revealed a machete from behind his back. Seeing this, I started running for my life down the trail and in the direction of my car. I looked behind me, and the guy was chasing me. I dropped my backpack so I could run faster. When I finally reached a clearing in the forest and could see my car, I was still sprinting. I grabbed my keys from my pocket and unlocked it. I got inside, locked the doors, and had the engine on in less than 5 seconds. However, the guy was still behind me and was able to completely slash one of my back tires before I could drive off. I drove on an almost completely flat tire for the next 5 miles back to my house. Right as I pulled into my driveway, I called the police and reported the man. Although I have no idea if he was found, quite frankly, I have no idea if the police even searched for him. A part of me wants to go back to retrieve my backpack, which contains hundreds of dollars in equipment, but there's no way I can bring myself to do it. Plus, there's no guarantee it's still even there. For all I know, the guy went back and took it. I still don't know what I stumbled upon that night. This was by far the scariest experience I've ever had and the closest I've ever felt to death. Back in late August of 1989, my friend and I set out on a 3-week sailing trip. Our job was to sail a 40-ton yacht named Tamaro from French Polynesia to San Francisco, and we were being paid handsomely to do so. We had years of sailing experience between us, but the 5,000-mile journey was the furthest either of us had ever been on. We were confident that we could do it, but early on, there was a worrying change in the weather's forecast. Statistically, hurricanes happened really late in the South Pacific and tend to arrive in mid to late October, so by setting sail in late August, we figured that we'd avoid the worst of the bad weather. But as the saying goes, man proposes and God disposes. 3 weeks into our voyage, we were faced with a Category 4 hurricane, which whipped up waves as high as 20-story buildings. We'd sailed through gales and storms before, but never a hurricane. We tried to escape it for 3 days, but the boat could only go 15 miles per hour, and so eventually, it caught up with us. It was too late for us to turn around and escape, so we had no choice but to brave it head-on. We put on our raincoats and boarded up the yacht, all while 140 miles per hour winds and 40-foot waves battered against the boat. The wind and rain felt like BB pellets on our skin, and it was like nothing we'd ever felt before. But we were still confident of being able to handle the situation. We just had to wait for the worst to be over. At one point, I remember heading below deck to get something, and then I suddenly heard my fiancé yell out, "Oh my God." We got caught in a massive wave. I was thrown off my feet, and the last thing I remember is my head smashing into something before everything just went fuzzy. I think I must have been out for a minute or two, because when I woke up, there was blood all over my face and raincoat, and I was lying on the floor. I couldn't hear my fiancé, so I went topside to check on him. The last I'd seen of him, he was strapping himself into the safety harness, but when I went to check on him, the harness was empty, and he was nowhere to be seen. I remember screaming, but I knew I had to pull myself together. There'd be time to grieve later, and if I didn't focus on the task ahead of me, people would end up grieving me too. I knew the yacht had suffered irreparable damage that would make it impossible to sail. The navigation system, engine, and even the sails were all waterlogged or shredded beyond repair. But even worse, the yacht itself was taking on water at crazy speeds. My instincts kicked in, and I started pumping water out of the cabin before using the storm jib and a broken pole to create an improvised sail. The only tools I had at hand were a sextant and a watch, but I had enough sailing experience to use them to navigate to land. After 41 days of drifting in the Pacific, rationing my canned food and water, I finally spotted land. It turned out to be the Hawaiian island of Hilo, and as I slowly drifted towards the harbor, I was spotted by a Japanese ship and rescued. For weeks afterward, I kept one of my fiancé's old shirts wrapped around my pillow. His scent was the only thing that got me through. I put all the pain and grief to the back of my mind, and once I was safe, it all came gushing out of me like water through a broken dam. It took me many years to get back to sailing, and these days I'm much more cautious about the jobs I accept. I thought about retiring from it altogether, but after a while, I realized that it's where I belong. If there's one silver lining to the dark cloud of my fiancé's tragic death, it's that he went out doing what he loved most. I'm a police officer in South Italy. I've been doing this since I was 22. For the most part, it's not as exciting as it's cracked up to be. Not a whole lot happens in my county. Usually, the worst calls are disturbance calls or an occasional shoplifting, with something a little more serious sprinkled in there once in a blue moon. I've done just about every possible shift there is. I did my time on the night shift, and there were definitely some weirder calls during the night shift than the day shift. But this one time, I was working the night shift, and I didn't get any calls. I was just cruising on a quiet road with no streetlights and woods on both sides. I saw the reflection of taillights suddenly approaching on the right-hand side of the road on the grass. As I got closer, I saw that the driver's side door was open. I started to veer onto the grass as I slowed down, fully planning on getting out to see if the driver needed assistance. I saw someone step out of the car, stand by the door for a second, then start to run into the woods. I radioed the codes for a suspicious person or vehicle, then got out of the car with my flashlight on and my hand on my holster, just in case. In this situation, I had to expect the worst. I got to the front door of the car and looked inside, half expecting to see someone else sitting there, but the car seemed empty. There was a seriously foul odor emanating from inside the car, though. It smelled like a rotting animal. I called out to the woods, asking if anybody's there and needs assistance, and I stepped to the tree line, waving the flashlight around. I went back to the car to take a closer look inside the passenger side. There were multiple bloody tissues and paper towels on the floor on the passenger side, as well as the rear seats. They were soaked in blood. The entire papers were dark red. At some point while looking inside the car, I heard footsteps inside the woods. I spun around with my flashlight and yelled, "Come out of the woods." I didn't see anyone. Someone was hiding in there, and that was confirmed when I heard a deep voice somewhere beyond the trees and shrubs. I had no idea what the voice said. I responded, saying, "Show yourself, are you hurt?" I prepared to unholster my gun as I walked a little closer. I repeated myself, asking, "Are you hurt?" No response. The voice I heard before didn't sound like a person in pain, bleeding out. Additionally, why would they run into the woods upon seeing a police car? Something was way off. I went back to the car and requested assistance. I noticed, as I investigated the car further, that it had no plates. When I went back inside the rear, I found something that made me almost puke from shock. There was something heavy wrapped in bloodied paper towel. I unwrapped it with my gloves on to find a severed hand. It took me a hot second to realize what it was because it was completely dark red, soaked in blood. Now, this situation went from a 5 to a 10. I radioed that there was a possible murder and needed backup. I now put my cruiser's lights on to help other officers more easily identify my location. When backup arrived, we did a thorough search of the woods, looking for possible blood trails. Nothing, though. There were not even any blood trails leading from the car, which meant that the hand and blood on the tissues I found may not have been from the person who I saw run into the woods. Eventually, the K9 unit had to come and search for the person. Hours upon hours went into the search, well past dawn, turning up nothing. The vehicle was taken into custody. It had been reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town, who said he had no idea who could have stolen his car. Fingerprints had been collected from the steering wheel, and DNA testing had been done on the hand. There was not a single match to anybody in the database. To this day, there was never any progress in finding out who the driver of that car was and whose severed hand that was. When I was 16, my mom had a job that required her to be out of town a lot. Because of this, my dad would often take me out to eat for a good part of my teen years. I remember one night we both decided to go to KFC for dinner. It was around 6 p.m., and my dad had just finished up his shift at work. Back then, my dad worked as a police officer and, at least at the time, would work pretty normal hours. Anyways, we went to KFC and got our usual. On our way back home, I remember we were pretty deep into a conversation, though I don't remember what it was about. After a while, I noticed my dad wasn't really responding anymore. We were fairly close to our house, but still on main roads before we needed to turn into our neighborhood. At first, I thought he just lost interest, but I glanced across and noticed he was permanently looking in the rearview mirror. I asked him what was up, and he mentioned how the car behind us had been following us ever since we left the KFC parking lot. I remember glancing behind us, and sure enough, some blacked-out SUV was tailgating us. My dad mentioned how we needed to verify if this car was actually following us. He proceeded to pull into the next street and do a few turns just to get back onto the main road. I will never forget that feeling, that sinking feeling, as I watched the car sharply turn back behind ours. Now, it was around 9 p.m. on a weekday, so there weren't that many cars on the road. The car behind us then put its high beams on, and at that point, my dad was completely focused. He had fully shut me out, putting all his attention into losing whoever was following us. A few minutes of this went by when he told me to grab his phone from his pocket, call someone in his contacts, and put it on speaker. My hands were shaking at this point. I could barely press the buttons. I remember a cheerful voice answered, but before the guy could say anything else, my dad quickly summarized the situation. There was a pause, and I could hear voices speaking in the background along with radio beeping sounds. My dad was yelling at me to keep naming the streets we were on to the guy on the phone, as at that point my dad was still randomly turning down different streets trying to lose the car behind us. Okay, turn into the Tesco car park. It's coming up on your left. We've got 3 response vehicles coming in from the other direction, the guy on the phone said. My dad responded, and, as we swung into the near-empty car park with the car behind us still in close pursuit, blue and red lights quickly surrounded us in what felt like all directions. The sound of sirens was deafening. My dad bolted out of the car and ran in some direction. After a few minutes of shouting, the driver's side door swung open. My dad got in and calmly started driving away. As we turned around in the car parked back towards the entrance, I could see the police surrounding the vehicle that had been following us, and 3 men in what looked like their late 20s were handcuffed, leaning over the car. On our way home, my dad told me everything. He explained that he was on a drugs team that dealt with the interception of large shipments of drugs that were being transferred across the country, something I hadn't known until that point. He continued by saying people would lose a lot of money when they were caught, and some didn't like that, which sometimes resulted in specific officers being targeted. My dad would quit his job as a police officer a few years later, though he admits this was by far his most disturbing experience, especially considering I was along to witness it. It was around noon on Memorial Day of 2017. My car was in the shop for a few days, so to the outside world, it would seem that no one was home. I was sitting in the living room watching television when I noticed a shadow being cast from the window behind me. I thought nothing of it as the window faces the street, and our front lawn is not very big. To me, it seemed like someone was just walking down the road, no big deal. Almost simultaneously, however, someone passed by the window to the carport heading to our side door. I went to check it out, and before I got to the door, he knocked. When I answered the door, I saw him in a white duct-taped motorized scooter, now under our carport. He told me he had been walking down the road pushing his scooter and he was wondering if he could rest for a moment. It was a hot day, and I could tell he had been walking. I decided to give him a break and let him sit under my carport for a minute. I even gave him a mellow yellow from the fridge, thinking if he had a cool drink, he would leave as soon as he was finished. I returned to my living room. Then there was another knock, but this time on the front door. I answered it, and this guy was asking if we were selling a scooter here. I told him no, and he apologized and then walked off. I closed the door and looked outside the window and saw that the guy in the scooter was still there. At this point, I was really suspicious, as most people would be. I decided to make something up to get the guy to leave by saying my friend was about to be here and that he needed to park there. When I opened the door, I asked him if he was feeling all right now, and he told me he was just resting. Before I could tell him my made-up excuse to get him to leave, the guy from the other door came from around the side of the house. He talked to the scooter guy and said, "Hey man, I've been looking everywhere for you. I thought you might have been stealing these people's scooter." They laughed for a moment and then both walked to the street with the scooter. I closed the door and decided to watch them from my front window. They both loaded the scooter in the back of a big red truck parked in the street that was not there when I talked to the front door guy. The driver was staring at the window I was looking out of, and after they got in, they took off. I called the police, and an officer came over almost immediately. I live a block from a police department. When I told the cop about what happened, he told me they had similar reports of a guy with a scooter casing houses, probably thinking that no one was home for the holiday. He told me that I probably scared them off since I was home. Still, though, I'm very lucky that they weren't violent. Every Memorial Day, I think about what happened. It was late afternoon, and I was probably around 10 years of age at the time. I was on my way home from my school football when I realized an odd man was walking along my street. At first, I stopped walking and examined the man for a moment. There was something about him that just did not sit right with me, the way he moved, the way he looked, the way he was looking at things in such definitive detail. I could not really put my finger on it. All I knew was that his presence made me feel extremely uncomfortable. I went and sat behind a car so he could not see me, and I waited for a few moments as he walked into somebody's driveway out of view. I ran back to my house, which was only a few doors down. It did not take me too long to reach my driveway. However, when I stepped onto my driveway, I felt like I was being watched. I did not look back. I rushed into my house to tell my mom and grandparents what I had just seen. Of course, they just brushed it off and made an excuse for it to not be some kind of alien man. I could not be bothered to stand around and try to convince them, so I went up to my room and stared. I stared out the window for a while, and then there they were. My window looks out into the driveway, so I could see him clearly. He was tall, maybe 6'5" or so, and extremely skinny. His neck was abnormally long, and his shoulders were narrow. He wore a white sports jersey and a pair of baggy jeans. The top of his head was large and veiny. Overall, he was a weird-looking person. I bolted downstairs with the most intense adrenaline rush I had ever had to tell my family. Out of breath, I stuttered out my words, and they walked out into the living room to take a look for themselves. My mom's face turned pale as she stared into the eyes of the person who was now stood up right against the living room window, so close, in fact, that you could see the condensation from his breath on the glass. He gently pulled up a notebook from his pocket and started writing. As this happened, everything was quiet, and everybody was frozen in place. It was the eeriest atmosphere I have ever experienced. A few seconds passed, and he finished taking his notes. He strolled back to the driveway. Still pale, my mom turned to me with an expression of terror and complexion. The only thing we knew to do from here was to contact the police, which we did. However, they looked for this man all over the neighborhood and could not find him anywhere. Overall, this experience has probably been one of the most bizarre and terrifying I have ever had. I am hoping someone can help me figure out what happened here. I'm hoping somebody can tell me who or what this thing was. I've read a lot of things online, and this sounds a lot like abductions I've heard in the past. Luckily, I didn't get abducted, but what do you guys think? My junior year in college, I had a strange experience. First, a few background details. My dorm room was attached to my roommate's, so I had to go out through hers to get to the bathroom or the hallway. She was a light sleeper, but I wasn't the type to be out late, so it didn't matter. I had 2 normal operations in my life at that time and discovered that while under anesthesia, I would wake up briefly toward the end before I was supposed to. If I got a mosquito bite, I had to deal with it for at least a month. I'm not a fast healer. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I woke up briefly somewhere else and then went right back to sleep. In this dream, I looked left, I looked right, and then I passed back out, just like if I was in surgery. I was on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined, facing the wall. There was ambient noise behind me, and the echo suggested it was a very large room. There was nothing sinister about the noises. On either side of me was a row of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, 2 people were having a conversation sitting on a bench against the wall. One was a person in a dark suit, the other, I don't know what it was. It was small, and I saw its hands, which appeared to have darker, grayish skin. They were speaking together, so animated and excited, like 2 old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, and they didn't notice me wake up. I didn't recognize the dialogue. Though I don't speak German, Mandarin, Russian, etc., I can recognize them when I hear them. This language was wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I said to myself that that was a messed up dream and went to the shower. As I passed my roommate, who was still in bed, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was odd. After my shower, I started to put my makeup on and noticed something on my face. I leaned closer and could not believe what I saw, 2 perfectly parallel lines, impossibly thin and impossibly perfect. There was some clear hard gel on the top, and that's what I felt. There was no blood. My own hair was thicker than the width of the cuts, yet I could see down into my skin a little. This was 1996. I had never seen anything like this. These days, I would say it was a laser cut topped with liquid Band-Aid, but neither of those things seemed prevalent in those days. I said, "Okay, there's an explanation. I slept on a staple or a paper clip. I do homework in my bed all the time. I went and scoured my pillow for anything sharp and found nothing. So, I got my sewing needle, a staple from some homework, and a paper clip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made cuts on my face similar to what was there. Immediately, blood welled up, and the skin was jagged from all three objects, and the width of all cuts was thicker than the laser cuts. I determined that nothing in my room could have made the cuts. I didn't have an X-Acto knife, but I knew the blood would well up the same way if I did. I skipped my first class as I tried to figure out what to do. I kept obsessively feeling my face all day, in awe of the perfection of what was there and how it could have come to be. There were only 2 people on campus rich enough to have a digital camera, which meant I would have to borrow a friend's 35mm because I didn't have my own. That meant I would have to explain myself to my friend and possibly the photo shop when the pictures came back. Who would I even give the photos to? Who would I even contact, and what would I tell them? In those days, if you even said the word alien, you were a pariah. After hours of mental debates sitting on the edge of my bed, I gave up thinking about it and finished my classes for the day. I sat on the edge of my bed into the night, debating, unsure of what to do. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up. The cuts were gone, completely healed, no trace of even a scar. I was disturbed for a few days, but then I eventually forgot about it. A few years after graduating, I decided I was going to have some dental work done and went to 2 different offices to get quotes. They both took a full facial X-ray. I had long since forgotten my crazy dream and the cuts until I sat down across from the first X-ray technician and pointed to a strange thing showing up above my teeth. I asked if I was looking at a mirror image because it was on the same side as my cuts had been rather than the opposite side. No, I was told, the X-ray was actual, not a mirror image, so the right side of the image corresponded with the right side of my face. I pointed to the almost square image above my teeth and asked what that was. "It's just an X-ray anomaly," he said. He didn't seem bothered by it. I figured that meant there was some damage or irregularity with the X-ray plates and let it go. Then I went to the second dentist, an orthodontist, and had another X-ray done. You guessed it, the square was there in the exact same place. This time, I didn't even try to make polite small talk or beat around the bush. I pointed to the square and said, "What is that?" This time, the tech looked at me funny and said, "It's an X-ray anomaly," and she leaned closer and whispered, "We see them all the time," in a way that gave me goosebumps. This was in Spokane, Washington. I didn't know what else to say, so I said nothing. Could it be that whatever negatives or plates or whatever they used for an X-ray were damaged in exactly the same spots and exactly the same shape? Maybe, I guess. I don't know much about X-rays. But after that, I reflected on my situation. I don't feel freaked out, but I think there might be something in my face put there by somebody else. Here's what I know, we do this all the time to other species. We chase them in helicopters, shoot at them with tranquilizer darts, take rectal temperatures, take blood samples, stamp radio tags in their ears with no regard to if it hurts or the trauma of the event, or if their furry buddies will ostracize them later because they have something funky on their ear. In my situation, I was clearly well cared for, if it really happened at all. Someone was there as some kind of representative on my behalf. I was handled in such a way that if I didn't have a weird metabolism, I wouldn't have known what even happened. I never once felt pain. My cut healed instantly. If this is some kind of research-driven radio tag for the purposes of data collection or preservation of habitat or species, like we would do, they did it with far more regard for me than we have for other species on our own planet. I don't know what might happen if I get another X-ray 20 years later. I have tried to look when I go through airport security if anything shows up on the image we see in the booth, but I don't see anything. Surprisingly, I'm okay with this. I think it might just be science and nothing nefarious or evil. I wish my consent to be asked first, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived at this base in 2005, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long, and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that the little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turn off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I'd been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas, which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Steven partner had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, a cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So, come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check. Seeing as all the main maintenance guys had gone home for the night in this area, the only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We piled in, locked the gates behind us, and continued on our way. Steven was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. Steven made the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible as we approached the structure from my previous story. And I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear. But as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite the structure, and out of my left ear, I heard a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan began to ring inside the cab of the truck between the 2 of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I felt my blood turn cold, and I quickly turned to Steven and yelled, "Dude, cut that out." Steven turned to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he began to take his foot off the accelerator and asked, "Am I going too fast?" I remained silent for a moment, with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listened. I heard the noise again. My partner interrupted and asked, "What's wrong?" I quickly turned the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whispered to him, "Do you hear that?" He stopped the truck in confusion and listened closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both heard at this time that long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again, but he quickly interrupted and said with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck was easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine had that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time, that groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, Stephen put the truck in drive, and he hauled our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street, and that entire base veered us off the road to speed back. He nearly flipped the truck going around a curve, but it didn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the 2 gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. Stephen watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of it or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place and the other in that building behind you, as he pointed at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliché with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark. I'm what you would call a serial bridesmaid. Like the saying, always the bridesmaid, never the bride, that's basically my life. I guess I'm the woman that attends a lot of other people's weddings but never has one of her own. Anyways, when my friend originally asked me to be one of her bridesmaids, I happily agreed. Her wedding would be about 10 months from when she asked, and I wasn't too happy about the way I looked. I made it my mission to lose weight before the wedding so I could feel good in my dress. I don't think my friend actually took me seriously though, because even though I told her to wait, she ordered my dress in a larger size. About a month before the wedding, all the bridesmaids were asked to go in to try on our dresses. Given that I had lost around 80 pounds by that point, my dress was no longer in the size I needed. My measurements were taken, and I was assured the dress would be tailored perfectly to fit me at my new size and be ready for the wedding. I was ecstatic. I was so excited for everyone to see how good I looked in this dress. The day before the wedding, I picked up the dress and hung it up in the closet overnight. I was smiling as I fell asleep. I was so happy for once in my life to be wearing a dress that I knew I looked good in, and I worked so hard to get there. The next morning, I grabbed my dress from the closet and made my way to the wedding venue. We had all made plans to get ready together at the venue. We all put on our dresses, and when I looked in the mirror, I was in awe of the person standing in front of me. I looked incredible. I finally felt confident in my own skin, and that was something I hadn't felt in years. The only problem was the dress was super tight, and the lace on the legs was actually really uncomfortable. It felt like I was being poked at my legs, but I was so happy for my friend and so happy with the way that I looked that I tried my absolute best to ignore it. Throughout the ceremony, the itching and even pain just kept getting worse. It was most annoying when I would walk, but even standing still or just sitting didn't give me relief. After the ceremony, one of my friends noticed little spots of blood seeping from the bottom of my dress. I was concerned and was done with the pain, so I decided to change clothes before the reception. When I slid the dress off over my legs, I noticed my calves were covered in small dots of blood, almost like little puncture wounds that hurt to touch. I just assumed that it was because they were fresh cuts that needed to heal. I searched the dress for any possible pins left behind but found none, so I just assumed that it really was the lace that had cut up my legs like I originally thought. I changed into some shorts and hoped that I wouldn't have any more problems for the rest of the night. That wasn't the case though. Every step was painful, and every small movement I made in my legs hurt. By the end of the night, I was on the verge of tears and could barely even walk. One of my close guy friends had to carry me to his car and drive me home. The next day, I made an appointment to see my doctor. Unfortunately, they had no available slots open until the next week, and it would be 5 days until they could get me in. This was a problem. By this point, I could no longer stand. I knew that I'd be bedridden or at best able to walk only 5 feet to the bathroom or 5 feet to the front door. I considered going to the hospital, but I figured that I'd suck it up and deal with the pain until I could see my family doctor. I lived in a studio apartment at the time, so everything was within about 15 feet. For the next 5 days, I limped around my apartment in severe pain. It was horrible. It felt like someone was shoving knives into my calves with each step that I took. Finally, when it was time to see my doctor, he didn't tell me to get X-rays like I was hoping. Instead, he told me that it was most likely arthritis and prescribed me multiple medications, one being for pain. The pain meds helped a little bit. I was able to walk 20 feet before feeling the pain and needing to rest, but to me, that was better than nothing. For the next year, I worked from home. I completely lost my social life, and my friends visited me less and less because all I did was complain about the pain I was in. No matter how many doctors I went to and told about the pain, none would schedule me for an X-ray. I became increasingly concerned about the arthritis medication I was taking when I realized nothing had actually been done to confirm that diagnosis. I continued the pain meds but stopped the others. I'd actually gotten to a point where I didn't even want to live anymore. I almost wished that they would just amputate my legs so I would never have to feel this way again. I missed the life I used to live and the friends I used to have. For a year, I hadn't felt like myself, and I was done letting doctors tell me what was happening to me wasn't serious. I made an appointment to see another doctor, probably the 20th that year, and I made a deal with myself that I would demand that he send me for some type of diagnostics or X-rays. I didn't really know, but he did just that. I was scheduled to get an X-ray of my legs the next day, and that was the first day I smiled in a very long time. The day of the X-rays, I made my way out of the house with my cane and took a cab to the office. I laid there as they took images of my legs. Of course, the technicians can tell you nothing, so I had to wait for the next day to find out what was actually wrong with me, if the X-ray even said anything at all. The look on my doctor's face when he pulled up those images was priceless. He was shocked and horrified all in one, and the look on my face probably matched his. I finally saw what was wrong with me. In my legs were multiple 2 to 3 inch sewing needles shoved into my calf muscle. I had 4 in my left calf and 7 in my right. It turns out the seamstress who worked on my bridesmaid's dress a year before had used sewing needles to keep the fabric together when sewing, instead of regular pins, and had subsequently forgotten to take them out. On the day of the wedding, I had walked, sat, and stood in the dress, and in doing so, the needles were pushed further and further into my legs until I could no longer see them once the dress was finally taken off. I had been walking around with needles in my legs, doing damage to the nerves and muscle, for a whole year, and nobody believed me. Finally, I was validated. Surgery was scheduled for a few days later, as they now considered it emergent. I stayed in the hospital for a couple of days after to make sure that I wouldn't get an infection, and now, 3 years later, I am almost completely recovered. I still get minimal nerve pain, but it's nowhere near as bad as the pain I felt that year. I regrettably used to work at a hotel in our town. Our town had gotten hit by a hurricane a few months back, and a lot of houses were badly damaged, so many people vacated the place. The hotel is about a 15-minute walk from my house. The town and hotel name I'll leave out of this, as I really just don't want anything traced back to me. The hotel was a very standard bed and breakfast type place, you know, where they serve wet scrambled eggs, frozen sausages, and assorted cereals. The hotel had a busy month after the hurricane, as some people were out of their houses due to damages. But after a while, things quieted down, if anything, quieter than before the hurricane. I always worked nights from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Then someone would relieve me at 2 a.m., and they'd work till 10 o'clock or 11 a.m. I could always see how many people were checked into the hotel, and at the time, it was only maybe 9 rooms, which wasn't a lot at all. I could go the whole night sometimes without seeing anyone. There was a back break room for employees with a coffee machine, fridge, table, and a couple of sofa-type chairs. The employee bathroom was also back there. At night, I spent most of my time back there. There was a bell at the front desk that people would ring if they needed anything. I was in the back when I heard a deep voice from the lobby saying, "Hello," repeatedly. I got up and went through the door leading to behind the counter and saw a man on the other side of the glass. There was a glass barrier with an opening underneath about 10 inches high. He said he needed towels. I grabbed him a couple of extra towels and slid them under the glass for him. He grabbed them rather aggressively, shot me this weird look, then walked to the room's hallway. I stayed in the lobby, now sitting in the rolling chair by the monitors, and I just watched that man on the camera walk down the hallway. He was looking around weirdly, then he started rubbing the towels on his face. I said out loud, "What in the world?" Then he got in the elevator, so I went back to the break room. It was maybe 10 minutes later when I heard a voice again from the lobby. It was the same voice. I walked back out, and that man was standing on the other side again. He said very loudly, "My key card is broken." I asked what his room number was. He said it was something random, like 2C something with a letter in it. Our hotel rooms strictly had numbers, no letters, so I knew this man was lying. I told him, "Sir, our rooms don't have letters. Are you sure you're staying here?" His reaction was not something I was expecting, nor was it something I wish I ever had to be a victim to. He threw the towels on the floor, started smiling, and slightly tilting his head as he got closer to the glass. When his face was practically pressed up on the glass, he said, "I'm going to kill you," still with a smile on his face. Then he said it again, louder, and again. Each time he said it, it got louder until it was almost a scream. I screamed back at him, "I'm calling the police," and I did. I picked up the phone and showed him as I dialed 911. He kept his disturbing smile as he now started mocking me, calling the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher on the phone, explaining very loudly what was happening in front of my face. The sick man laughed and headed for the door in a slow walk. I told the dispatcher he was leaving, and when he was gone through the doors and out of sight, I said he was gone. She asked me if I still wanted an officer to show up, and I said no, it's all right. So the next couple of hours of my shift went slow. I decided for obvious reasons to hang around in the lobby now instead of the break room. There was one guest who checked in during this time. At around 2 a.m., my relief came, and I clocked out and was free to go home. I walked outside to the parking lot. It was cold out. I remember wishing I had brought my coat. I walked with my hands in the pockets of my light jacket and my hood up. Then I heard a voice in the parking lot. I turned around. There was a line of bushes that covered the first-floor windows of the hotel. It came from the bushes. I don't know what the voice said. I didn't care. I walked faster now. Once I got out of the parking lot, I was on a main road for a brief minute, but there were no cars on the road in this quiet town at this hour. After a minute, I turned left down a residential street that would eventually turn onto my block. It was dead silent out, not even the sound of any distant traffic, just the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement. And then the sound of someone else's shoes hitting the pavement behind me, only it was the sound of someone running as if on their tiptoes, trying to be quiet. By the time I turned around, they stopped. There was a car right behind me, and I almost knew that there was someone hiding behind it. I heard laughing and then a familiar voice saying quietly, "I'm going to kill you." Without even seeing him, I knew it was that man. I looked around, planning out my next move. I couldn't outrun a man, let alone wearing my work shoes. I looked at the nearest house. It had an upstairs light on. Someone was awake. I would go run and ring the doorbell for help. I looked back at the car, and I saw him, that man, peeking his eyes out from behind the car as he inched around it to the front. When he got to the hood, the rest of his face and upper body were exposed, and I could see his disgusting, crazy smile again. I ran for the house, screaming, "Help me." I made it to the front door and rang the bell at least 3 times. That's when the man grabbed me and started choking me, whispering in my ear, "Die." In that moment, I thought my life was flashing before my eyes. Then an angel in the form of a man opened the front door to the house and screamed, "Hey," at the man choking me. The man's grip was released from my neck, and I fell to the floor. I never turned to watch the man run away, but the man from the house helped me up and brought me inside. He gave me water and called the police for me, and I explained the whole story to the police. They collected the CCTV footage of the man from the hotel and put feelers out to track him. I was called into the police station when they did a lineup of people who looked similar to the man on the CCTV footage, and I was asked to point out which man I thought was him. I looked at all 5 of them for like 5 minutes, and I ultimately said it wasn't any of them. I don't know if the pressure and nerves got to me, but in the moment, I truly didn't recognize him to be in that lineup. I hope to this day I didn't make a mistake and let that man roam free. I faced a grim battle with a rare blood cancer, one that offered little hope for recovery. With the harsh reality of my condition looming over me, I made the tough call to forego treatment, accepting the uncertain road ahead with a heavy heart. In the weeks leading up to Christmas of the year in question, our secluded farm on New Zealand's South Island bore witness to a peculiar phenomenon. Strange lights danced across the evening skies, their erratic movements defying explanation. At first, we mistook them for PLS, but their sudden shifts and unpredictable patterns hinted at something more enigmatic. Our farm, nestled in solitude and isolation, seemed a world unto itself, far removed from the chaos of urban life. The sightings of these mysterious lights became our own private intrigue. We refrained from discussing it with anyone. One night, a week before Christmas, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed through the window a light descending on the paddock next to the house. When it touched the ground, I could see it was a disc-shaped craft. Instinct kicked in, and I reached for my trusted hunting rifle, hands quivering with a blend of fear and determination. But before I could even grasp it, they emerged, creatures straight out of a nightmare, their insect-like forms contorting in the dim light of our home. There they were, right inside our lounge. No idea how they so suddenly entered. It's like they just materialized. Their presence suffocated the air. It felt like the gaze of these four beings pierced one's very person. We were in a state of hyper-shock. Mary stood behind me, arms protectively enveloping our daughter. Mary recalls our innocent Leah seemed wondrously amused by the creatures, while Mary and I were in a state of pure anxiety and dread. We stood frozen, trapped by an invisible grip, unable to break free from the fear that held us in place. Despite my efforts, my limbs refused to obey, rendering my weapon useless against the encroaching darkness. I don't think any words can describe what was going through my mind at that time. While you are reading or listening to this, imagine for a while being in such a bizarre and threatening situation. While doubting my eyesight at that moment, in fact, doubting my very sanity, I simultaneously am confronted with protecting my wife and child against creatures that can simply materialize or dematerialize as they please. All of this while they control my body, rendering me absolutely incapable of my duty as protector of my young family. The entire thing is simply too ghastly to describe. That experience left a lasting mark on me. As swiftly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving us trembling in the wake of their inexplicable visitation. This eerie experience was a chilling reminder of our vulnerability in the vast expanse of the unknown. As Christmas Eve enveloped us, the air buzzed with the anticipation of the cherished family gathering in festive mart. The following day, our joint families were driving all the way to spend Christmas Day at our place, stay over the night, and drive back on Boxing Day. Despite the shadow cast by my illness, we had painstakingly prepared for the occasion, fueled by the promise of love and laughter that awaited us. Mary, ever the embodiment of resilience, orchestrated the culinary symphony in the kitchen with practiced finesse. The aroma of roasting turkey and freshly baked pies wafted through the air, a tantalizing preview of the warmth and joy that awaited us on the morrow. Yet beneath the facade of holiday jubilation lurked a solemn reality, a truth I had grudgingly come to terms with. This would be my final Christmas, a poignant reminder of life's transience and the relentless march of time. The events of the previous week were still on our minds, but as it caused no harm except for freaking us out, we decided that we would not let it feature in our thoughts for the next few days. If only it was going to be that simple. As the night wore on and darkness blanketed our home, a disturbance shattered the tranquility. I jolted awake, a sense of disquiet creeping through me like a silent specter in the night. Emerging from the comfort of my bed, I stumbled into the enveloping darkness, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. As I bore witness to a sight that terrified me, one of those very same otherworldly creatures was in our house. As I stood in the hallway, I saw it slipping into Leah's room like a phantom in the night. It seemed not to notice me, or maybe it was simply not bothered by my presence. Fear spurred me onward, my footsteps resounding through the silent corridors as I hastened to my daughter's side, only to find her bed and room empty. They had taken her, but how? Panic seized me. I grasped for the phone, desperate for aid in the face of the unknown, but fate, it seemed, had different plans. The telephone lines remained eerily silent, they were dead. The familiar hum was replaced by a chilling stillness beside me. Mary stood, her features etched with a blend of fear and disbelief. We found ourselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty, our world unraveling with each passing moment. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. I thought it was the craft outside taking off, whisking our daughter away, only the Lord knows where to. And then, as if beckoned by some unseen force, a wave of dizziness swept over us. The next moment, I felt sick. I remember Mary saying her head was spinning. Strangely, we both fell unconscious right there by the phone, both of us at the same time. If it was not so strange, I would have said our collapse was brought on by sheer shock, but I firmly believe it was something else. Look, both Mary and I, even amidst my illness, were pretty level-headed people. We were not the type to simply faint. The morning broke with the events of the night before veiled in a haze of uncertainty. As awareness slowly returned, I found solace beneath the covers. Mary's reassuring presence by my side offered comfort in the midst of turmoil. The covers in bed. How did we get to bed? My last memory was of us losing consciousness in the hall by the phone. But then a worse memory, Leah. They've taken Leah. Then something unexpected and beautiful happened. A sweet, innocent voice beckoned us from our slumber, drawing us to the warmth of the lounge. There, bathed in the soft morning light, sat Leah. Her laughter was a melody that chased away the dread and fear. Relief washed over us like a tidal wave, cleansing our hearts of doubt and anxiety. She was safe, untouched by the darkness that had threatened to consume us. We held her close, her embrace the ultimate gift I would receive on that Christmas day. As we basked in the joy of her presence, a sense of peace settled over our home, a peace forged by the unbreakable bond of family. We never discussed the events of the previous night or days with our family. Despite the horrific events leading up to our Christmas, the day itself turned out to be a beautiful experience of love and joy. As it was going to be my last, I only wanted to focus on making that Christmas the best memory for Mary, Leah, and our folks. We kept it that way throughout the festive season. New Year's came and was another joyous event with friends and family. Yet after that, life had to return to its normal routine, and with that returned the doubt and fear. Beneath the surface, a lingering doubt nagged at us, a question unanswered. What had truly transpired on that fateful night, and why did Leah's memories remain veiled in mystery, her innocence untainted by the chaos that had engulfed us? We sought answers as the new year broke. Without revealing too much, as we did not want them to think we were crazy, we had Leah checked out by a pediatrician and a psychologist. Both found her to be in excellent health and showed zero signs of trauma of any kind. So the truth remained elusive. Leah, a beacon of hope, stood unwavering in her innocence, her laughter a reminder of the resilience of youth in the face of uncertainty. However, her apparent lack of any trauma amidst what happened to her puzzled us. Yet, we were grateful our daughter was unscathed by whatever happened to her. Then February came, and it was time for my visit to the oncologist. Even though I knew what the path forward looked like, these visits were required to manage my condition as best as the clinicians could. I steeled myself for the tests and examinations. Blood was taken, and we had to be back for a follow-up the next day. I prepared for the inevitable affirmation that the cancer was staying its course. My only dread was that it might be speeding up, which would mean even less time with my family. When the specialist finally entered with an expression of confusion, I knew he had further bad news for us. Then our world changed. His words, when they came, shattered the darkness like a beam of light. Your cancer is gone. I will never forget his words. I remember him saying something like, "You are extraordinarily lucky. This type of cancer simply does not disappear by itself. Besides, severe cases like yours have never been successfully treated. Yet, here you are, clean, without any treatment." More tests were done, but they all confirmed the same. It was a miracle, pure and simple, a reprieve from the brink of death that defied all reason. Jubilation surged through me as we made our way home, hope and gratitude intertwining in a dance of newfound life. Yet with all that I had to celebrate, something was unresolved. At the edges of my consciousness, something was awakening, an unwelcome guest in the midst of celebration. And then, like a storm on the horizon, the nightmares descended, a relentless onslaught of visions and memories, each more nightmarish than the last. Strange lights and alien faces haunted my dreams, their presence a specter that loomed over me in the dead of night. With each passing day, the memories grew more vivid, more visceral, until the terror etched into my being. I relived the ordeal in agonizing detail, the chill of extraterrestrial surgical instruments, the pain of probing, incisions, grotesque needles, and more, all inflicted by beings that seemed devoid of empathy or remorse. Amidst the darkness, a paradox emerged. It was bittersweet, for within their cruelty, the insectoid creatures bestowed upon me a gift beyond measure, a second chance at life, burned through pain, sheer dread, and horror. The ordeal is too harrowing to recount in further detail. I cannot fathom why the creatures subjected me to such torment. Lily, now married with 3 beautiful children, remains as joyful and vibrant as ever. Untouched by the events that transpired all those years ago, despite undergoing regression hypnosis at our urging, she recalls nothing of significance. Curiously, it appears she was never abducted. Sarah and I seem to have manufactured memories of searching for her at home. Sarah never developed any nightmares or memories even remotely like mine. After all our anxieties about the apparent abduction of Lily, it seems that I was the only one who got taken. The motives behind the creatures' actions remain shrouded in mystery. Nevertheless, their intervention led to my survival. Faced with the choice between enduring these haunting memories and succumbing to cancer, is there truly a choice? Thousands of beautiful memories created by a long and fulfilling family life have made the horror of the abduction 100% worth it. This is narrated from the perspective of a female. This happened a few years ago in Rome, Italy. I was walking alone along the street that leads to the train station. It was around 2 p.m. on a working day, so almost practically no one was around. There were not many shops either on that street, and the few that existed were closed. A man was walking in my same direction just a few meters ahead of me. Casually, he turned back and noticed me. It was one of those instinctive reactions that you cannot conceal. His face said it all. He was roughly 6 foot tall and well-built, not exactly the body structure you would like to see such a face on. His eyes openly said, "I've been to jail and I'm highly likely to go back again." He went along his way ahead of me and then turned again a couple more times, slowing down his pace. In a few moments, the situation was reversed. I was walking in front of him now. I didn't turn around. It was useless. I knew he was following me. I didn't hurry up. I just pretended I didn't notice him. I was listening to the radio on my smartphone with earbuds in and just simply kept on doing it. But you can imagine just how much I was panicking on the inside, all alone on the street with a 6-foot-tall criminal walking after me. I kept walking, struggling to the very last bit of my soul, acting as if nothing was happening, while desperately searching for an escape out of the situation. Then, after a few more minutes like this, I saw 2 men talking vivaciously outside of their shop. I seized the occasion and stopped right after them, pretending to scroll up and down on my phone. With the tail of my eye, though, I kept glancing beyond the 2 men, and I was right because after a few moments I saw him stretching his neck trying to spot me. He saw I had stopped and he was leaning against the wall near the 2 other men. He then turned back and went away. I'm pretty sure that I must have had a guardian angel that day who sent those 2 men and placed them at the right time and right place. Nothing else happened, but only because I was extremely lucky. To all the ladies out there, never take for granted that you're safe just because you're in broad daylight. And never give in to fear. One of my close friends, Tom, was a really nice guy, super personable, and a really amazing friend. Everyone who met him loved him. His literal only flaw was the fact that he smoked heavily, like very heavily, at least a pack and a half a day. He was overweight and everyone was worried about him, that he would die early from lung cancer, and being overweight wasn't helping his chances. But he never listened to us. He was one of those guys that actually enjoyed smoking and how it made him feel. He'd always say, "Come on, guys, just let me live my life. I don't want to quit." It made me and the rest of his friends sad that he didn't value his life like we did. None of us wanted to lose him, sure, but we also wanted to see him succeed and have a family of his own one day. The event that occurred that has me writing this happened on a cold winter night in December. One of our mutual friends, M.O., was getting married, and of course, he invited Tom. He was always the life of the party wherever he went, since everyone knew and loved him so much. The only thing about this party was there was a very strict no smoking rule, as children would be in attendance and the other guests expressed not wanting to be in a cloud of smoke during this amazing day. Tom told me that he really wanted to go to the wedding and reception, but he was nervous that he wouldn't be able to last that long without a smoke and would feel embarrassed to leave because everyone would know what he was leaving to go do. Part of me was relieved to hear him say that because being embarrassed by smoking meant that maybe Tom had begun to dislike his smoking habit. It gave me hope that maybe one day soon he would quit. I tried to reassure him that everything would be okay, and worse comes to worse, he could sneak away for a quick smoke and be back before anyone noticed. I was trying to be supportive and not enabling, but I also know someone with a pack and a half-a-day habit isn't going to be able to last hours without getting nicotine withdrawals that would make his life just absolute torture. Tom snuck out a few times during the ceremony for a quick smoke, and it didn't seem to bother anyone. I felt for him. I was addicted to smoking for so long, and I knew how hard it was to quit or to try and go without them for a while. Things would change at the reception, though. It was being held at Vi's house, and it was in a very cramped part of town. Vi lived in a townhouse, and there was nowhere Tom could really go to sneakily have his cigarettes. He came to me, sweaty and worried, and told me that he was just going to have to leave if he didn't find somewhere to have a smoke. I didn't really know how to help him or what to say, but I did tell him this day was important and to find a way to stay and support his friend. He nodded, and then I watched as he walked out the front door. I had no idea that that would be the last time I or anyone else would see him alive. What I tell you next is what the police hypothesized happened to Tom. Tom exited Vi's house and turned right down the street. He walked about 100 feet where he found a small alleyway between two townhouses blocked by a gate. He must have thought that it would be a perfect place to have a smoke where no one at the reception would see him, so he pried open the gate and very carefully squeezed himself between the two buildings and closed the gate behind him to ensure that no one could see him. He stood with his back against one of the buildings, as he wasn't quite small enough to fit facing the gate. The space was just that small. He then took out his pack of cigarettes, slid one out, and lit it, placing it between his lips. Sometime during the process, Tom managed to drop his pack of cigarettes. Without thinking, he bent over to retrieve them. As he bent down, he became wedged between the walls of the two buildings. He was stuck with the top portion of his body almost upside down since he was bending down to reach for his pack of cigarettes. In his position, his chest was pressing against his legs as he slid further down the wall toward the ground, only becoming more and more stuck with each passing minute. It's said that even if he wanted to call out for help, there's no way that he could have with his chest being restricted while in the position he then found himself in. Eventually, his cigarette escaped from between his lips, fell onto one of his legs, and burnt a hole in his pants. It didn't take long for Tom to suffocate to death with his weight crushing his own lungs. It became impossible for him to take a breath. He told no one where he was going, and everyone at the reception, including myself, just assumed that he had left without saying goodbye. It was out of character, but sometimes people just act out of character. Tom was capable of taking care of himself, and he wasn't the person people usually worried about. He was just one of those guys that seemed to have the best luck. After a few days of no one hearing anything from Tom, I called the police. A search was conducted near Vi's house, as that was the last place he was seen, and his body was eventually found in that same position in that small alleyway. He had almost completely frozen from being out in the cold for almost 3 days and nights, and it was a big ordeal trying to get him out. His mom was called to identify the body even though we all knew it had to be him. We were horrified, of course, and mourning Tom was one of the hardest things any of us had ever had to do. We expected smoking to maybe kill him one day, sure, but not in the way that it had. The guilt I carry is extreme. I should have told him that it was okay for him to go home if he was having a hard time, and it would have saved his life. His funeral was packed with all the people who loved him. We shared stories about his life and how great of a person he was. I just still can't help but think maybe he'd still be here if we never shamed him so much for smoking. I live in a safe town, the kind of town where you can leave your car doors unlocked. Hell, you can usually get away with leaving the doors to your house unlocked. The crime rate is very low, and I live on a dead-end block. I had just gotten home from work around 7 p.m. after a 10-hour shift and was preparing a late dinner when the phone rang. The second I picked up, I heard the sound of the person on the other end hanging up. I don't know if this has any correlation with what's to come, but if it does, that's even more horrifying. On nights when I get home late, especially after 10-hour shifts, usually I'll just cook, eat, clean up, take a shower, then lay in bed watching TV for an hour before going to sleep. This was one of those nights. I was physically and mentally exhausted, which led me to making what I learned that night was a serious mistake. I was laying in bed watching One Piece for my third run. Sometimes I'll drift off to sleep with the TV still on when I'm just completely beat, and that's exactly what happened this night. I woke up to the TV still playing the One Piece. I had slept through 2 episodes. I felt around the bed for the remote and turned it off. In the now freshly silent room, I was able to hear little creaks in the wood under the carpet. I felt adrenaline kick in as I looked across the dark room. I felt I could vaguely see the shape of a very wide figure. As I aimed the remote at the TV to turn it back on to light up the room, before the TV was even on, I started choking on my own spit as I tried to say, "Please leave." The TV came back on, and the room lit up a tint of blue, revealing this woman in a wedding dress looking at me with the veil covering her face. I tried to scream at first, but nothing came out of my mouth because I was just in pure shock. I sat up, pressed against the headboard of my bed, frozen. That's the best way I can describe what I was doing in that moment. The woman in the dress, whose face I could barely see, walked over to the bed whispering, "Where is my groom?" over and over, but each time she said it, she got louder. Her whisper quickly turned to a yell, and she grabbed the edge of my mattress and started shaking it. I screamed back at her to leave me alone. Then I got off the bed, pushed her, and ran to the bathroom across the hall and locked the door. She followed me, trying to open the door, banging on it and repeating the words, "Where's my groom?" I yelled at her, "I'm calling the cops," and luckily I had my cell phone on me. The woman was crying now on the other side of the door, still knocking and banging. The last thing I heard her say was, "I have to get to my wedding." I heard her stomp down my stairs, screaming and crying. Then I heard the front door slam shut. I was on the phone with 911, and I explained what just happened. I checked the living room, and she was gone. I stepped outside to see if I could see which way she ran, but she was out of sight. A police officer showed up shortly, and I described her as some larger woman in a white wedding dress and veil, how she was screaming, "Where's my groom?" and "I have to get to my wedding." I couldn't help with the direction she ran to. It was either down the only direction the street goes or the woods to the right. Because of my exhaustion after my 10-hour shift, I had forgotten to simply lock my door, something I honestly never even thought was a problem in my neighborhood. But this just goes to show that even in the best of neighborhoods, you're not always safe from crazy people out there. I think this woman was off her rocker and belonged in a mental asylum, and I hope police or somebody found her roaming the streets that night and brought her somewhere to get her help. It was Memorial Day weekend of 2021. The world was recovering from COVID, and everyone was looking to celebrate. That included my friends and me. Our friend George has a really nice big boat. Well, his dad has a big nice boat, but George gets to use it. The lucky bastard was born into a lot of money. We do reap some benefits from being friends with him, though. Out in the bay was a big boat meetup planned for Memorial Day, so our core group, Grant, Hale, and I, all met up at George's house on the water, and we took the boat out from there to meet up with George's other boat friends. There were a bunch of boats tied together in a shallow part of the bay, and everyone was hopping from boat to boat and walking around in the water with drinks in hand. I was getting really drunk along with everyone else, and unfortunately, that included George. No one really realized until it was too late that he had way too much to drink and was not okay to drive the boat back home. I told him to sleep it off in the cabin, so he went down to sleep. It started to get dark after so many hours of drinking and mingling with other boat people, and one by one, the other boats left. We were the last boat left, just the four of us. I went to check on George, and he was still knocked out. We had to stall for hours with each other until he finally woke up. He did seem more sober now, so he started to slowly drive the boat back in the direction of his canal. On the way, we noticed the lights of another boat seemingly following us. George started freaking out, thinking it was the Bay Police. He didn't want to do anything suspicious like speeding up or slowing down, anything that might draw attention, so we kept our speed steady. We made it to the canal, and he lives about 5 minutes up the canal. The boat behind us was still following us up the canal. George was really starting to freak out, worried he'd get a DUI and lose his license, and of course, his dad killing him. The canal is a no-wake zone, so we had to slow it down even more. As we went down the canal, the boat behind us was catching up to us. At this point, we were fully expecting the boat to be a police boat. We started discussing a story to stick to, that we took the boat out and just hung out on the bay. We started hiding all the beer cans, ready to lie completely about having had any beer. We got to George's dock, and he looped the boat around to a line next to it. He did it pretty smoothly for someone who was intoxicated. The boat that was tailing us the entire time approached, and as it began to pass us, we realized it wasn't a police boat at all. It was just a random boat. George said out loud, "Who the hell is this? He knows everyone on his canal," and he said he'd never seen that boat. As it directly passed us, we saw 3 men standing on the back of the boat looking at us. It was honestly in a very aggressive way. George taunted them and said, "What?" None of them responded. Their boat passed us, and they continued to watch us. While we were all relieved it wasn't the police, George was now nervous as to why they followed us all the way down the canal when they don't even live on this canal. I said perhaps it's someone visiting a friend's house for Memorial Day, and he reluctantly agreed and said, "Could be." He tied up the boat to the dock, and we helped the best we could. He said he'd clean it tomorrow. We all went inside his house. His parents weren't home this weekend, he had the place to himself. So we suggested throwing a last-minute pool party, but it was already like 10 o'clock, and there wasn't really any chance of throwing anything big that last minute. So the four of us went back outside to just hang by the pool, continuing to drink, with all of us planning on crashing at George's place for the night. That boat passed by the house again within maybe 10 minutes, and that's when we really got suspicious. The men on the boat again stared at us, and this time George said nothing. The night became a daze. At some point after this, my memory gets really foggy, as I guess I blacked out. The next thing I remember is waking up with extreme cotton mouth in the middle of the night. At first, I thought the unbearable thirst I was feeling was what caused me to suddenly wake up, but I was very wrong. I looked around the room and saw Grant and Hale on the couch as well, sleeping. I went to the kitchen to drink some water from the faucet like a water fountain, that's how thirsty I was. But in the kitchen, I was met with someone else, dressed in a cliché all-black robbery outfit, including a black ski mask, and he was clear as day holding a gun. I didn't scream. He aimed the gun at me and told me not to make a sound. It was an unexplainable feeling, knowing that my existence could have ended at any given moment. And everything would turn black, washed over my body. He said to me in a quiet voice, "Where is the owner of the house?" I whispered, "I don't know." He asked me where the owner's bedroom is, and I shakily said, "Upstairs." He had me lead him upstairs with a gun to my back, threatening to shoot me if I made any sudden moves or calls for help. When I got to the top of the stairs, I realized there were two men behind me, not just one. Both of them were in the same all-black robbery attire. I really didn't want to, but I led them to George's room where he was passed out sleeping. The two men shut the bedroom door and had me wake George up without making a commotion. George came to reality, looking around the room and momentarily freaking out before one of the men got closer to him with the gun in his face, telling him to be quiet. The man with the gun pointed at George demanded to know where the safe was. George's family is loaded, and their house is huge along with their boat, and it's common for rich families to have a safe somewhere in the house. George led the two men and myself to his dad's room, to a certain closet. At this point, they forced him to call his dad to get the combination. George explained to his dad that we were being held at gunpoint and he needed to give the combination. George's dad complied. The two men took all the contents inside the safe and put them into a bag. This included savings bonds, cash, jewelry, and various important documents. After this, they ran out of the house. We didn't hear a car speed away or anything, so they must have had a getaway vehicle further away, not on the block. After posting on multiple outlets, including the Ring Neighbors feature and reporting it to local news outlets, no one could identify the two men. I think it's fairly safe to say those men on the boat followed us to find out where George lived, since it was a very nice boat and they must have seen potential dollar signs. I'd never been so scared in my life. I actually could have been killed if I made one wrong move. I hate weddings. Everything about them. I hate the sappiness. I hate the same overused color palette. I hate buffet-style food. The list could literally go on forever. But worst of all, I hate all my friends trying to set me up at their weddings. For some reason, no one understands that I have no desire to be in a relationship or even get married myself one day. Contrary to popular opinion, I actually enjoy being by myself. It's nice. The thought of waking up to a man laying next to me literally sounds horrible. I don't need someone to share my life with. I don't need romance. I just need my dog and a hot cup of coffee in the morning before I go to work. That's it. But since I choose to surround myself with the friends I made in college, and since I choose to put up with their mundane loser boyfriends, I'm stuck going to at least 5 weddings a year for the past 3 years. Now, you may think I'm being harsh by insulting my friends' husbands, but I'm not. It's not necessarily harsh if you're really just telling it like it is. I love all my friends a lot, so I wouldn't actually tell them any of this to their faces, but I just want to make it clear for the sake of writing about what happened, all the feelings I was feeling throughout this period of my life. So, to get to the point, I'll begin by telling you this all starts with my friend Sona getting married and, of course, inviting me to the big day. I wasn't thrilled when I got the invitation, just like I'm never thrilled when I get any invitation to any social situation. But Sona was one of my very close friends, and I knew I had to go, not just because she wanted me to go, but for once, I actually wanted to be at a stupid wedding. Sona wasn't just a friend I'd met in college, she and I had been friends since birth. Literally, our moms were best friends, so we, of course, also were best friends. Besides, I didn't find her fiancé as insufferable as the others that I'd met of my friends. The day came, and it was sweet seeing her so happy. For once, I wasn't so miserable at a wedding I was attending, and I kept thinking to myself, this isn't so bad. But cue the disaster, this ended up being so bad. Yeah, this day ended up being the beginning of the worst 5 months of my life. During the reception, all my friends were introducing me to different men that, of course, I was never into. But there was something different about Tony. This man straight up would not leave me alone. Once my friends had introduced me to him, he just followed me everywhere I went. Even when I tried to escape him by going to the bathroom, after 30 minutes of hiding inside, he would be there waiting for me to come out. This guy was so annoying and started to be really creepy. He just kept repeating that he was an empath and would not stop begging me to let him tell me what kind of person he knew I was. Literally just kept saying, "Oh please, please let me tell you about yourself. I can teach you how to grow as a person," to which I kept responding, "I know myself very well, thanks." I even tried just ignoring the guy, but that didn't even work. Eventually, he just took it upon himself to, as he called it, empathically tell me all about myself, which weirdly enough just ended up being a bunch of insults about my personality. One that stood out was when he told me that I was a coward and just to know it, and I could prove that wasn't true by giving him a chance. After standing there for what felt like hours, listening to this man trying to destroy my self-esteem, I just walked away. He followed until finally, I turned to him and screamed in his face to stop following me, stop talking to me, leave me alone, and that he was creeping me out. He said nothing. Instead, he got this serious, almost angry look on his face and slowly turned around and left the reception altogether. From then on out, I'd receive emails from Tony telling me how he forgave me and that I didn't need to worry about apologizing. He would set up dates and tell me when and where to meet him, and when I never showed, he would write to me saying how worried he was about me. I don't know what friend gave him my email, but I swear to God, if I ever find out, I'll be punching them in the face. And that's when the visit started. I began getting knocks on my door. He would call out to me, saying that he knew I was in there and that I needed to just let him in so we could talk. He tried the knob a couple of times, which I found exceptionally scary, but for some reason, I thought that he was innocent enough, so I didn't report him to the police. Instead, I began blocking his email addresses, and whenever he messaged me on social media, I blocked him there as well. Then, I started getting gifts left on my doorstep to my apartment, just stuff like chocolates and teddy bears and the occasional balloon. I always just threw the stuff away because I found all of what was happening incredibly creepy. Obviously, when I told my friends what was happening, they told me that I had a stalker and needed to get a restraining order immediately. The friend who had originally introduced him to me ended up telling me that she barely even knew him and that he was a friend of her husband's and had been someone's plus one, and he had actually asked her to introduce him to me. I thought about reporting the stalkerish behavior, but I wasn't too concerned. He never tried to get to me actually in person besides the few times he showed up at my door until one night. I had gotten off work late and was walking to my car in the parking garage around 1 a.m. when I saw him. He was walking toward me from the other end of the parking garage, and all he said was, "There you are, sweetie. Ready to come home with Papa? Daddy missed his little baby." And I swear to God, the scream that came out of my mouth was one of pure terror as I bolted to my car. The distance I had to cover was slightly less than that of what was between him and my car, and it felt like a race to save my life. Thank goodness he was overweight, otherwise, maybe I wouldn't have been able to outrun him. With only about 30 feet between myself and him, I reached my car, opened my door, shoved myself inside, slammed it behind me, and locked the doors as fast as I could. He reached the car only seconds later, and with wide eyes and sweat dripping down his face, soaking his clothes, he said to me, "Baby, baby, baby, come out. Daddy just wants to play. Come home with Papa." He slammed his fist into the window as my engine roared to life. He began shouting at me to just get out of the car. As I sobbed while putting my car in reverse, I saw him run toward what I assumed was his car, and as fast as I could, I peeled out of the parking garage and made my way toward the police station. In my rearview mirror, I saw him following behind me, weaving between cars to get as close as possible. On my right, I saw the police station come into view. I pulled in and, with no thought, put my car in park right in front and popped out. I ran inside the building with tears streaming down my face. In a panicked voice, I screamed, "Help me. Someone help me. I think he's gonna kill me." And that's when Tony came bursting in, grabbing me by my hair and trying to drag me out. Thankfully, officers surrounded him faster than the blink of an eye. They even drew their guns, and I could hear as all their voices demanded that he let me go. He released his grip on my hair and slowly put his hands up. They then tackled him to the ground and immediately arrested him. There's really not much else to say from that. He's still awaiting trial at the time I'm writing this. I know a lot of people say, I don't know what they were going to do to me, even though they had duct tape and a shovel in their car. It's cliché and stupid, but for me, I know. I know what he was going to do to me. He was going to kill me. This is something that happened to me when I was much younger. I believe I was about 11 or 12 during this time. I lived at home with my older brother and my parents. One of my favorite things to do after school most days was to unwind by playing some video games. I would go upstairs to my bedroom and start playing on my PlayStation 2 for a while. Sometimes, I would play all the way until it was time for dinner. So, one day I got home from school and went straight up to my bedroom to play some video games. Both my parents were still at work, and my brother was still at school. That's how things usually were for an hour or two after I got back on most days. I remember playing video games, and a little while in, I heard my brother getting home downstairs. The front door opened and closed, and I heard him walk inside. I thought nothing of it and I kept gaming. But about an hour later, I got a call from my mom. I had a home phone in my bedroom and saw through the caller ID that it was my mom's cell phone. When I answered, she told me that she was on her way to pick up my brother from his friend's house, and they would be home soon. My dad was going to pick up some food on the way home from work, and she wanted to know what I wanted. I told her whatever food it was that I was in the mood for that night. Then we said bye, and I hung up. It was only after ending the call that I realized it was strange that my brother was not home. If he was at a friend's house, then who had I heard entering our house? My heart started racing, and I had a terrible feeling. I carefully walked to my bedroom door and opened it up. I had never heard the person walking upstairs or near my bedroom. I didn't know where they went after entering the house. So, after not hearing or seeing anything, I left my bedroom. I quietly walked down the hallway and looked downstairs. I still saw nothing. Then I went down the stairs. Once there, I walked around the main level of the house looking. I did not see anybody, but when I was near the kitchen and kind of the front door, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like somebody was down there. I quickly ran away and went back upstairs to my bedroom. A short time after entering my room, I heard the front door to the house open and close again. At that point, I ran back downstairs. When I got to the front door, I saw what looked like a man walking away down the street. I didn't recognize him and only saw him for like 2 seconds. It might not have been the same guy who had been in the house, but I think it was. I then locked all the doors and called my parents, who then called the police. The door had been left unlocked for when my brother got home. I hadn't known he was going to a friend's house. Looking back, I can't believe it happened. I didn't even know I was home alone with some random guy downstairs. I'm really glad that he didn't go near my bedroom.